Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Catherine Nordel, and I'm a member of the Trust Board of Trustees. We're so glad that you're able to join us today for the 15th webinar in our Cultural Competency Forums, entitled Promoting Sensitive and Flexible Therapeutic Responses to Cultural Stresses.
Presenting today's webinar is Dr. Ryan C.T. DeLapp. Dr. DeLapp is a licensed psychologist in New York, Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. He's the director of DEI initiatives and creator of the Racial, Ethnic, and Cultural Healing Program at the Ross Center. Dr. DeLapp is widely recognized for his expertise in supporting minority individuals with healing from and learning to navigate cultural stressors within their lives. He's authored over 20 publications and has conducted over 100 presentations discussing considerations for assessing and treating racial and cultural stress in diverse populations. We are very fortunate to have him here to share his experience with us today.
Thank you all for the introduction and for this platform. And as I pull up my slides, I think we're good to go. I myself am a clinical psychologist that has been working on this topic of ways to support young people and adults who are experiencing stresses related to their identities and their backgrounds for quite some time. And today I just want to talk to you all about some of the ways in which I organize my practice and also supervise the trainees that I work with to be responsive to the needs that come up in therapeutic practice. Just as in terms of disclosures and a conflict of interest, I am the recent and proud author of this book, Empower Yourself Against Racial and Cultural Stress. The entire presentation will not just be a marketing expo of this book, but it will include some materials from this. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. Today's agenda for the next couple of hours, so 3 hours, we'll be going through these four broad categories. Initially talking about before the conversation even starts, before our clients even broach subjects related to their identities or any stresses related to how they identify, what things might we be doing as clinicians to ready ourselves, our minds, our emotions, and even our clinical responses for these types of discussions. I will go through a set of different self-reflection exercises as well as, actionable things you can be doing in your day-to-day life to be making sure that you're kind of cultivating this responsive mindset ongoing throughout your practice, regardless if you're a new clinician or a seasoned vet. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about what things can you be looking for in your clinical practice to know when cultural stresses are coming up. This term cultural stress may not be one that is readily familiar to you or something that you maybe think necessarily about, but hopefully when I unpack it in a few more slides a little bit later, you will see that these are things that naturally come up for any client, regardless of how they look or what background they come from. There are ways in which we might need to be responsive to the ways that cultural stress show up. And then we'll talk about how do we assess not just what has occurred, but how this stress is impacting the day-to-day lives of the clients we work with. And then also how can we use evidence-based interventions and culturally sensitive orientations to be creating sensitive treatment plans and responsive treatment plans to the needs that our clients are uh, speaking of. And so this is our general overview. I'll be pacing us throughout all of this today, and hopefully you find the information very helpful. So let's start with a question what is culturally responsive care? I know that in a time where the concept of culture, the concept of, someone's background, someone's identity, diversity, even the idea of DEI is become very taboo and is maybe a censored topic. I think it's really important to be very clear as to what I am talking about here and kind of the lens that I am encouraging us to take today in terms of cultivating this mindset. And so there's three components that I talk about here, and that's any programming. And what I mean by programming here, I mean whether that's programming that's includes how your offices are organized, how your websites are presented and curated, the materials you offer your clients in terms of the paperwork or even the intake questions that you use, all the way to the services that you provide. Thinking of how does your program, in this first bullet point, respect the strengths and the values and the perspectives of each individual's cultural background? How do you try to show an interest in wanting to learn about these aspects of their background and wanting to show that you're looking to incorporate the parts of their background that you feel, or that, excuse me, that they feel are really pertinent to their sense of self and their sense of world, how they navigate the world. Also, thinking about programming that also tries to create space for someone to acknowledge that there are certain stresses that maybe are related to their background, maybe that extend beyond the kind of classic DSM-5 symptoms that we maybe are attuned to assessing and looking for. But how might we look for the ways in which racism or sexism or transphobia or cultural stresses or any aspect of someone's religious background, how might these aspects of someone's culture be kind of intersecting with the symptoms that they're coming in, or maybe creating a whole separate set of needs that maybe you can be responsive to within your conceptualization and treatment planning? And then, of course, we want to acknowledge that we don't want to be just kind of judging a book by its cover. And just because we've, seen one person or 10 people or 50 people from a certain subset or a certain demographic, that we make an assumption that everybody has the same strengths, everybody struggles with the same stressors, but that we allow our clients to be both individuals and members of their communities that they endorse. So how do we also acknowledge the individual within and apart from their surrounding environments? And so, in this first juncture of our time together, we're going to talk about what kind of activities and perspectives can we be trying to cultivate that will allow us to, really honor these three bullet points here. So, I also kind of think that when anytime you're talking about culturally responsive care, it's really a balancing act. It's not a set of skills, it's not a set of tools, it's not a fact sheet that you're able to just pull from at any given moment in time. It is truly an orientation to how you practice and show up in the room. And so this balancing act, I think, is really kind of try to capture this balancing act and with this graphic here. And also the balancing act I'm going to ask you all to have as you're listening to this webinar. So each of you all, I would imagine, and I hope that you're able to celebrate your collective expertise, the things that you bring to this field, the services that you are equipped to offer the people that you serve. But at the same time that we have our expertise and we have our knowledge bases, we also are tasked with remaining open and curious and humble in how we approach the world around us. When we sit across from somebody with our expertise, how are we also remaining open to their stories and curious about how maybe their stories exceed our expertise? And maybe being humble and understanding that maybe there is something that we haven't fully learned and that doesn't really fall within everything that we know. And so today we can absolutely focus only on the patient or the client and their experience, and thinking about what does openness and curiosity look like whenever we're sitting across from somebody. But before we even get to that, I'm going to ask you all to do a little bit more of some self-reflection, some self-examination, looking within in terms of who you are within this profession and what you are bringing to the space. And in that, we're going to celebrate, or I'm going to give you or encourage you to reflect on ways that you can celebrate your story, the strengths of what you bring to the space, the values, your why in terms of why you've chosen such a field and such a career. And at the same time, I want you all to maybe take some time to acknowledge your struggles, your shortcomings, your biases, or the barriers that make possibly showing up in the way that is culturally responsive very challenging. This isn't a encouragement or a nudge for any one demographic. This is for all, regardless of your racial and ethnic and cultural backgrounds. I'm asking all of us to be very curious and open, and balancing both our stories in terms of our strengths, but also our struggles. And maybe you may notice some things that come up for you when you're talking and we're thinking about these struggles and the biases that we may have. And I would also ask you all to be mindful of any defensiveness or any dismissive kind of perspectives to what I'm going to suggest that you think through or work through with those who are closest to you. I'm going to ask you to kind of notice if that's coming up or if there's any type of emotionality, any type of discomfort. I want to ask you to use your mindfulness skills to note it, but not necessarily be consumed by it. Because all of this is really trying to help us to get towards a growth edge, an opportunity, something we can step towards in terms of showing up better and stronger and more effectively with the people that we are so blessed to be able to work with. So this balancing act is really what I'm hoping that we are able to kind of acknowledge its complexity, but also ultimately arrive at a place where we're able to find some opportunities to grow and be better for in the days to come. So how is that going to look? So over the, I guess, approximately maybe the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about a couple of steps for promoting a culturally responsive mindset. And again, if you're kind of joined a little late, this is a sense of the conversation or the work before the work. This is before you sit down with the client, before you start the conversation, or as you're having these conversations, how can you continue to be sharpening and growing and fine tuning your mindset to be able to celebrate someone's strengths, create space for their stresses related to their background, and also making sure you see the individual in all of it. And so we're going to start off with mindfulness, this self-reflection component of these steps. And in the materials that you have or that were sent to you for this training, you see the slides, but then there's also a PDF that's titled Self-Reflection Exercise. You may find it helpful to open that on your computer if you're able to do so. But if you're not, that is completely fine. You'll still be able to follow along. But this self-reflection exercise is truly asking you all to take some time to think through these four boxes. I'll tell you a little bit of a story. Like the reason why this exercise came to be, this who am I diagram is what I refer to it as. It actually started with an 8-year-old that I was working with a couple of years ago. And this 8-year-old had been removed from the care of his biological parents and was in the care of his maternal grandmother. And this kid had had a lot of unfortunate traumatic experiences at a very early age in a very early part of his life. And a lot of the messaging and his self-concept was around being a bad child. And so when I asked him, I was like, how was your day or how was your week? Whenever we would start our sessions, he would say something along the lines of, Dr. Ryan, I didn't do anything bad this week. And of course, my heart broke, understanding that a 8-year-old felt like that was the way he had to present himself to his therapist, or at least maybe even to others. And so I wanted to provide a tool for us to maybe start reorienting. And so that was the inception of this idea. But I've since realized that some of us as clinicians maybe need to take some time as well to reflect on these four components of who we are and what we bring to the therapeutic space. And so, on the one hand, the I am refers to the different identities or intersecting identities that we bring to this profession. And really thinking about the worldviews and the experiences, the triumphs, and also the stresses that are attached to these different identities, the privileges as well as the struggles that are attached to these identities. These are all influencing the lens through which we maybe interpret our clients' cultural experiences. Our interests, even thinking about what do we like, in your offices, typically it's a sometimes a window into who we are, whether you're a sports person or you like cartoons or Marvel or you're into some other or you're into gardening or plants or whatever the case may be. There's sometimes a window into our interest in some way, shape, or form in our therapeutic spaces. But even beyond what we decide to show our clients, our interests can also shape how we show up in the therapeutic space. Our strengths, these are the abilities or the resources that we attribute to ourselves and that we attribute to kind of what we can lean on and draw from whenever we're in our professional spaces, but also just generally in life as we're trying to attain certain goals. So really thinking to yourself, like, what are your strengths? What do you bring to the table that feels like something that you can reliably lean on to be able to accomplish important goals within the therapeutic work that you do? And then the I care about. This is your value set. These are the reasons why you feel like maybe this work or the way in which you show up in this work is really important to you. And taking some time to do a bit of some values clarification. Now, if we were in person together, I would give you a chance to take some time and go through this self-reflection exercise. But since we are in a virtual webinar space, I will ask that you all do take some time and do this, at another point and where you have some time to really focus and really unpack each of these four boxes. I've even had schools do this with like teachers and educators, or I've even had clinicians do this in their consultation spaces. And it's a great way to really think about kind of who you are when you're coming to this professional setting. And then beyond what you use to populate these boxes, I include some reflection prompts at the end. These reflection prompts are more focused on yourself. So I'll go through these different categories. So identity salience is a concept that comes from the identity literature, and it really reflects kind of the sense of, we are a collection of many different identities that are intersecting, but in any given moment of time, a subset of our identities or an identity can become more um, in focus, or we're more conscious of it, or we're more salient of this part of ourself. For me, it's if I'm walking into a room and I see that I'm particularly the only person of color or the only male of color in that space, by nature of the contrast, I am more that part of myself, my maleness and my blackness is become something I'm much more aware of in that particular setting. So for you, when you fill out your who am I diagram, my question would be to you is which parts of your diagram become most salient within your professional role? Whether that's as a administrative, a lead, or a supervisor, or even a direct service provider. What are some of the parts of yourself that become more salient when you're fulfilling the duties of your role? And does this salience, does the parts of yourself vary depending on who you're sitting across or who you're working with? And then also, whenever you notice this salience, whenever you notice that this part of yourself is accentuated, what do you feel? You'll become more familiar with this beat diagram throughout the latter part of this training. But this is my tool for really encouraging the people that I work with to use their observe and describe skills, to observe and describe their body sensations, their emotions, their action urges, and their thoughts. And so for me, as a black male, whenever I step into a space and these parts of myself are accentuated, there are times where my beat can be more kind of reflective of pride and excitement and a sense of contentment. But then there are also times where that beat can shift and be a little bit more anxiety provoking, or be a little bit more kind of unsettled or uncomfortable or distressed, depending on the dynamics of the professional context that I'm in. So even for yourself, when you're thinking about that salience, what can influence the level of emotional experience that you have, depending on which identities are salient and also what the context that you're in. I think it's also important to really kind of think about your journey, right? What has your journey in discovering who you are been like over the years? For myself, when I first graduated internship and went straight into working as a licensed professional, I would honestly say that, how I thought of myself as a professional, my professional identity, and kind of how that was integrated into my overall sense of who I am was slightly different than kind of where I am roughly 10 years later. And so just thinking about that growth from when you were early career to when you're middle career to when you're maybe in a senior level aspect, how has that evolution taken place, and who and what has influenced this level of discovery and discovering these parts of yourself? And then I think possibly the one of the most important components of this, particularly when it comes to the therapeutic process, is thinking about the parts of your who am I diagram that have felt marginalized, that have felt aggressed against or stressful whenever they are acknowledged or implicated in your environment versus the parts of your identity that grant you privilege or access to things that maybe aren't necessarily a reflection of any of your efforts or any merit, but they're just afforded to you. And what context do you find yourself feeling these types of sense of marginalization or maybe even benefiting from the privileges? And I don't, of course, don't have time to unpack all of this, but a book that I was exposed to about a year and a half ago, I think does have some really helpful tools for understanding how power and privilege can be differentiated across many different domains and that it's not necessarily this binary of either you do have power or you don't, or either you do have privilege or you don't, but there are some kind of different domains that you can really look for and see how that may impact your work and so forth. And so this is maybe a resource to check out and see if it maybe enhances your self-reflection as I'm encouraging. So after you've taken time, hopefully, to spend some time reflecting on these aspects of who you are, the next step is to really think about how who your who am I diagram intersects with the people you sit across from. To say differently, if I am somebody who I love sports, I'm a big time like basketball, football, any type of competition type of person. And when I'm thinking about metaphors and I'm working with a client who does not share that same interest, am I able to acknowledge that sports metaphor may not necessarily be the most responsive and sensitive and applicable thing to use with a particular client because their who am I diagram or that part of their who am I diagram maybe isn't as that's not a part of their interests. Or maybe if my strength, maybe one of my strengths is to be very conversational and to process things via dialogue and asking questions. But I have another, I work with kids, and one of the kids that I work with really loves to draw and he likes making comic strips. And so, is it appropriate for me to reflect and honor that his strength, his abilities are really rooted in visual learning and being able to create and draw? And so, how can I not centralize my interests and my strengths and how can I accentuate his who am I diagram? And so that's really kind of what we're going to be thinking about for the next few moments is how our who am I diagrams may intersect with those and how we can be responsive to the differences and the similarities. And one way to think about our responsiveness to the differences is to look at a brief discussion of microaggressions. Now, one of the ways that sometimes we may be compelled to make sense of differences between our who am I diagram and somebody else's is to pathologize those differences or to see those differences as meaning that this person is, dysfunctional or this person is, not doing their best, because they're not showing up in a way or they're not expressing certain values or expressing certain strengths or interests that maybe feel natural or we feel that someone should. Or possibly when we are sitting across from somebody, instead of being able to celebrate that this person can be an individual apart from their kind of cultural background, and they may not endorse or all of the things that we may know that some members of their community may be experiencing, we may still kind of like not honor that individual kind of characteristic, and we may pigeonhole people or assume that somebody must fit within a certain type of kind of belief system or have a certain type of experience. And in the article that these components came from, one of the examples that they give is maybe seeing somebody who is dressed a certain type of way and assuming that that person maybe, isn't an intellectual or doesn't have a certain type of job stability or career stability because of the ways in which they're dressed, even. And that can be a way in which we maybe misinterpret that difference from what we think somebody should look like if they have certain types of lived experiences. Excluding or rendering some aspect of somebody invisible. So really not giving somebody the space and the time to talk about all aspects of their who am I diagram. That's one of the reasons why I actually assign this whenever I can early in the therapeutic process, because I want to give people the opportunity, or at least invite this type of self-disclosure in the therapeutic process early on, so that I am able to maybe try to appreciate the kind of fullness of that person, rather than kind of reducing them down to a particular part of themselves, or not giving themselves that part of themselves any type of credit. And then also there may be the temptation to look at these kind of different aspects of the who am I diagram, particularly race and ethnicity, as being something that is irrelevant. If somebody's coming to you for psychosis or depression or anxiety or some sort of DSM identified condition, and you're kind of like, well, I don't really think race has anything to do with this, because they're really coming to me for healing. That may be a opportunity that you're missing to really also acknowledge how those symptoms are also intersecting with other cultural stresses, as I talked about in slides before. So what can we be doing instead? By using things like the who am I diagram, or just having conversations related to these aspects of someone's background, we can try to start welcoming and embracing and celebrating differences. We can challenge and limit pigeonholing. We can explore and invite the invisible, and we can see beyond the problems and the symptoms, and be able to see if there's anything else beyond those kind of symptoms that may be relevant within the therapeutic process. So, um, I want you to maybe take a moment, and of course, you're not going to be able to kind of say anything back to me, but take a moment. I want you to think back to your last therapeutic contact with the client of color, or if you don't have a really large caseload with clients who identify as persons of color, think about the last time you worked with somebody who was somebody from a background that was different than yours, whatever way you want to define that. And then I want you to think about how these components of your who am I diagram, and how they related to their other persons. So which identities appeared most salient for the person that had a different background than yourself? What interests were they most open to discussing? What strengths did you give them a chance to showcase in their work with you? Or so far, what have you allowed them to showcase? And then also, what values seem to be the most important to them? And really thinking about, if you have answers to these questions, how did you get to a point where you were able to learn these bits of information, especially if you didn't have a tool like the Who Am I diagram to give this information in one condensed framework? Okay. So as you're kind of putting all of that information together, now it's kind of thinking about, what do we do with this information? If we once we learn what somebody's, identities are that they feel are salient, that are important for us to know, their interests, their strengths, their values, kind of, what do we go from there? Well, I go back to mindfulness and really reflecting on, how does the details of their who am I diagram compare and contrast to your own? And then again, how does it feel when you're coming up in contrast, when somebody's talking, maybe you're a white clinician and there's a black client who's talking about experiences related to racism that is directly related, perpetuated by somebody who maybe kind of fits your demographic. What does that feel like to be listening to somebody process those experiences? Or if you are an individual who, identifies as a part of let's say you identify as being a part of a certain political party, and your client is from a different political party, right? How does it feel to be sitting across from them as they're expressing their political views and their perspectives? What comes up for you in your beat? Or on the flip side, if you are sitting across from somebody who maybe has a similar value set, or a similar even set of strengths, and you're like, man, I really see myself, or I can really see where they're coming from. What does that feel like to be sitting across from somebody with similar experiences? Or maybe it's even that somebody has similar stresses, or they've endured similar microaggressions or sources of cultural stress that you have, and they're leaning on you for support while you also have lived these experiences. What does that feel like in your beat? all of these types of reflections and this mindful acknowledgement are things that I encourage clinicians to be talking about in their consultation spaces, in their supervision spaces, because what's going on under the hood and what's going on emotionally can be influencing what types of conversations you broach, what types of questions you ask, what types of interventions you consider. And so I'm just hoping that you all kind of take this as a nudge, or just an affirmation if you're already doing this, for maybe including this within your consultative and supervision spaces. Beyond just the mindfulness prompt, I also want you to think about, are there ways in which you are tempted as a clinician to centralize your who am I diagram over components of theirs? So, are you ever tempted to centralize or overvalue aspects of your identity or your interests, your strengths, or your values while supporting someone else? I gave an example of that with, me maybe sometimes being tempted to use sports metaphors when somebody else is not kind of interested in that, or centralizing my kind of type of strengths over somebody else's, or even my value set. If I feel like this is how, as a healthy and a way of going about doing something, and somebody else has a different kind of way of valuing wellness and health, or something along those lines, how do I reconcile that discrepancy in a way that doesn't centralize myself, and but maybe creates opportunity for processing? What stereotypes might you be tempted to rely on when interacting with a client? Or what parts of your who am I diagram are you tempted to judge, or sorry, of their who am I diagram, are you tempted to judge, criticize, or invalidate? For example, if somebody is, coming from a certain part of town, or has a certain type of job, or a certain type of career, or a certain type of interest, how are you tempted to maybe judge that without maybe fully exploring some of the mechanisms underneath those components of that person? And my hope is that we're also able to kind of celebrate and also think of ways to centralize and value and embrace and celebrate a client's who am I diagram with some of these questions. Have you ever invited the client to share any of the things that we've been talking about so far? Have you ever looked for any stereotypes that you hold and really tried to think through those or work through those outside of the therapeutic process? And how have you incorporated the client's identities and their strengths and their values and their interests into the therapeutic process? How have you centralized that? My guess is that many of you can probably teach a whole course on that last question. But my hope is that if you're finding it hard to do so, that this is a nudge for you to lean into your consultative spaces to kind of think about, what would that even look like, and what would, in exploring the benefits of doing so as well. Okay, so we've now gotten through this bullet point of being mindful and self-reflecting on kind of our stories as clinicians, and then also being conscious of how our stories can be impactful to the ways in which we show up on behalf of our clients in the therapeutic space. And so my hope is that you got some tools or some questions or some insights to really dig into a little bit deeper after this webinar has finished. But there's more to come for promoting this culturally responsive mindset. This next bullet point highlights being genuine. There's maybe at one point in time when I first thought about this bullet point, it was when, being culturally responsive and sensitive was, kind of felt like more of a buzzword. When I used to um, be a supervisor within an internship program, I would always interview psych interns, or potential psych interns, and a lot of times they would talk about the excitement of being culturally responsive within the inner city community that we were in. And I was always curious what was underneath that interest. Like, what was it that really compelled them to make that their mission, and to kind of seek out the internship site that I was at? And so one of the ways for you to kind of explore what is your genuine interest, especially in a time now where there may be a number of reasons why, or outs for being culturally responsive, and a number of ways to just kind of be like, oh, this is too challenging, or there's too many barriers to being able to do this type of work. What would, within your who am I diagram, maybe suggest that, like, I really want to double down and be kind of committed to empowering and collaborating and supporting my clients whenever they are, and really and celebrating kind of who they are. And so this is just another way to kind of get at maybe this genuine commitment to this. And so I would encourage you to take some time and think through that. Beyond this, the opportunity to self-reflect and sit back behind closed doors, I lean on kind of the encouragements of my graduate school mentor, Dr. Monica Williams, who talks about in a paper that is cited a little bit later, that in order for us to, in her paper, she talks about being anti-racist, but I think it's beyond just being anti-racist. It's also about just this idea of being able to be responsive to the needs of all of our clients, is that it means that we take action. We get out of our typical routine of life and we do some things differently. And so some of that taking of action can be through our education, what we read, what we consume, what we use to kind of educate ourselves, such as joining a webinar like today. Or it's about what we want to learn about ourselves. So this is a clip from the IAT, the Implicit Associations Test, that is accessible via, you can Google it, the IAT, or you can also, it's through affiliation with Harvard. And it has a number of different domains that you can look at, whether you have some form of a bias towards some sort of demographic. This is depicting the IAT for Blackness versus whiteness. And I would say it can be very insightful and humbling. The last time that I took this self-assessment, I was surprised to find that I was rated to have a slight bias for whiteness. Now that I am somebody who does a lot of reading and research and advocacy on behalf of the Black communities that I've been a part of, I'm a very proud member of my community. So to find out that there was a bias in some ways against my community or towards another community was one that was quite surprising. But if you remember my first slide, instead of me getting defensive or dismissive, I try to cultivate a sense of openness and curiosity. What is that? If this has any merit, in what way might I notice its merit? And then it just happened. I was on a New York City subway. And as you all, if you all have never been on a New York City subway, it can be quite packed, quite congested. And so there's really no concept of personal space on there. And so I was sitting down and I noticed that there was a Black male who was standing right beside me. And I noticed my body tense. And I noticed myself become more vigilant in ways that I hadn't been with any other individual who was standing near me. And also, the individuals that were near me happened to be of lighter skin complexion, so that I assumed them to be either just not a part of the Black community. And it was in that moment that I realized that like there was a automatic response, an automatic threat response that was within my body that I did not necessarily pay attention to. And it was one that I had to kind of acknowledge and be honest about, that this was something that was within my response and that this was something that I wanted to be very intentional about trying to address. And so there's a paper by, I can never remember this person's first name, but it's Divine et al. 2012, where it talks about different steps for addressing different certain biases that we may have. It doesn't just have to be race related. It can be related to any kind of demographic. And so I really tried to start applying some of those tenets to really kind of think through my reaction, whether instead of tensing up, I intentionally relaxed myself. I tried to give alternate kind of understandings or kind of things that against that stereotyping beliefs, and really try to be very thoughtful of how they showed up in other areas of my life. And I'm not saying that it's fixed, but it's something that I thought was something I wanted to be more mindful of, because I didn't want those types of things presenting and influencing how I showed up for other people, whether it's clients or just other people in my day-to-day life. Another thing that I find, particularly as we get closer to talking about culture in the context of this talk today, race and cultural stress, is I find that having conversations with people outside of the therapeutic contact that you have with people. So another way to saying this is the first time that you're talking about race or racism or assessing microaggressions or talking about microaggressions, my hope is that it's not with somebody who is experiencing those things, that you've had times to talk with people who are consenting and open and willing participants in those conversations about these topics, a space where you're not responsible for somebody's care while also working through anxiety or working through your own discomfort with finding the language for these conversations. And so my hope is that you're able to create those spaces in a work context or in your own social lives. And so that way you can really kind of work through some of the language, ask the questions, get feedback, while also not having to carry the responsibility of making sure that you're taking care of somebody's mental health. And then the last but not least is allyship or finding ways to kind of stand up for and against different forms of cultural stress in your surroundings. This is also a way to really kind of take this sense of, this is a genuine interest of mine. I'm very, curious and want to be supportive of members of different communities. And so also thinking about what does it look like to be, supportive of people who are not within your community, to be able to learn about things that are going on in other communities. And Dr. Williams gives some different tips in that being an anti-racist clinician paper about how to go about doing so in a way that is not performative, that is not being a social justice warrior or being, she talks about white saviorism in this paper, but about really doing so with a genuine sense of wanting to kind of connect with these issues and being supportive of impacted communities. And so that's another way to kind of also think about kind of sharpening this culturally responsive perspective. Okay. All right. So creating safe space is another kind of concept for culturally responsive mindset. So a couple of tips here. Whenever we are broaching subjects, and I'll give you some tools a little bit later about how to broach subjects related to cultural stresses and race and ethnicity. The goal is to empower the voice of the client and communicate an interest in their voice. So, what does that mean? So one of the things is obtaining consent. Uh, I used to work in a really busy hospital system and where you had a lot of different expectations of check boxes that you had to complete in order to have a compliant assessment or a compliant note within the system. And so sometimes it felt like just I was just going through the motions and asking all the questions so that I was in compliance. But I think it's to kind of bring back the humanity into that process sometimes is remembering that these stories are the property of other people. They have the right to be able to say what they do and don't want to say to us. And we have the privilege of listening. So, how do we honor that by kind of one way to honor that is by saying things like, I am interested in learning a little bit more about your experiences of, as somebody within a particular community. And I'm happy to talk about that today or at any point in the future. Right. So it's not demanding that they answer these questions, but creating an invitation. Another one that I also like to think about is summarizing without interpreting. I think sometimes if somebody kind of communicates, hey, yeah, the other day, I really felt like this person was just really insensitive towards me and I really couldn't figure out why, but it really felt like it had something to do with my, what they thought about my skin complexion or my who I was or where I'm from. And, instead of, kind of saying to them, yeah, it sounds like this or providing some sort of interpretation, I find like it could be helpful to just repeat their words back to them and make sure that you're hearing exactly what they said, using DBT's give skills with like being gentle and interested and validating and easy, having an easy manner without trying to kind of, redirect them towards some other alternate understanding or explanation. Oh, well, is it possible that they could have maybe misunderstood you or maybe they didn't even weren't even thinking about this aspect of yourself. I think those types of like redirections or alternate explanations, I can't say 100% of the time, but and a number of the times that when people are really broaching these subjects with you, if that's your first line of defense, that can be very off-putting and make people feel like maybe this isn't the best place to bring up these types of disclosures. Another point that I like to highlight in terms of creating safety is, think about the ways in which you try to acknowledge yourself and your capabilities and being able to hold space for these conversations. I've, both in supervision of other clinicians and also in my own therapy, whenever I was, seeking support, I had somebody ask some question or make a statement very similar to this, both trainees and also a provider that I was seeking support from, saying, I couldn't possibly understand everything you're going through because of all of my insert some sort of privileged identity. And I'd like to discourage that as a form of kind of broaching or kind of starting holding space for these conversations, because what it can do is can plant seeds of distrust, and it can also even dissuade folks from seeing you as a credible person to bring this up, and or end up putting the responsibility on the individual, like the client, to kind of affirm your qualifications. And that's not, you don't want to centralize yourself in that way or centralize your who am I diagram in that way. Another thing can also come up if you are somebody who shares that identity with a client. Another typical thing is to say something along the lines of, as a Black male or as somebody who has a similar kind of shared experience as you, I get it. Now, I'm not saying this is a complete no, never do it. If you do it, then you're messing things up. But I think if it's more of like internal check, if what you're thinking in your head is that I get it, but you don't really try to explore the aspects of their experience that don't fall neatly within the box of your experience, then it could be, again, centralizing your who am I diagram and not giving them space to really talk truly about the fullness of their experience, because you're making assumptions about what their experience might be. Another kind of tied element to kind of creating a sense of safety in the space is acknowledging that, like, we are fallible and that sometimes we make mistakes. And so, this is sense of dialectic. If you bring in kind of the DBT perspective, I'm trying my best and looking for ways of how I can be better and do better. And so here is some kind of a flow chart, if you will, of ways in which you can kind of recover and be open to feedback. I won't go too much in depth with each of these boxes, but I think of a situation where a client of mine, I was very interested in steering the conversation in a certain direction. But I asked the question in session that steered it towards the direction that I wanted to go, or I thought the client might benefit from going. And it kind of was very off-putting to the client. I saw that they got really quiet and actually was like, I don't really know why I wasn't really done. I thought we were getting to something really good there. Fortunately, they felt comfortable enough to give me that feedback. But imagine if they didn't, and they just kind of felt like I was like, redirecting the conversation in a way that felt, not aligning with their goals for that session. But in the case of this particular individual, he gave me that feedback, and I encourage us to accept it, acknowledge it. And so acknowledging the intent, I appreciate that, that was uncomfortable and that wasn't the direction that you were hoping that we would go. My thought is, we had our agenda as a CBT clinician, we had our agenda, and I just wanted to make sure we saved time for that. But I see that you still had some additional reflections or additional things you want to really think through before I ask that question. And just checking in, am I understanding kind of that experience? And he was very acknowledging, yes, I felt like that was kind of abrupt. I apologize, I asked some clarifying questions, and that was it. And in my head, I made the internal adjustments. I talked to my consultation team and really kind of thinking through, like, how do I kind of walk that line a little better between adhering to the agenda, but also making sure that I'm not like a robot, just kind of not being responsive to the things in the room. So my hope is that by looking at these six boxes here, it gives you some ideas of some questions to kind of think through with your team of folks when you're kind of trying to respond to some hard feedback that maybe a client has given you either verbally or maybe they're non-verbally giving you in the therapeutic process. And then last but not least, we're getting to the last bullet point of cultivating a responsive mindset, a culturally responsive mindset. And that is, instead of being someone who, in these conversations related to culture and diversity and cultural stresses, that you just kind of are doing what feels right. There's a number of models and theories and frameworks that our field has been blessed to have. And my hope is that you have been oriented to many of them or some of them, so that whenever you are trying to think of a way to anchor your response and have a clear intent in terms of how you're responding to these situations, that even if you're distressed and you're anxious, that you have some sort of guiding light for how you carry the conversation. And so my hope is that what we talk about for the remainder of today will be another tool added in that theory, kind of that theory base that you bring to your work. And so, just to kind of give us an overview of where we're going to go, we all kind of maybe have some way of trying to discover what our clients' values are, what their goals are, whether that's goals related to the relationships they want to have in their life, or wellness related goals, whether that's related to their emotion regulation or their sleep routines or some aspects of their wellness, or even achievement. Maybe we're trying to support our clients in getting, into the types of grades they want, or getting into the college they're interested in, or being able to perform in their jobs in the ways that they would like. And we're, maybe astute in assessing the ways, the different aspects of their experience and their environment that can be frustrating their progress towards these goals. But for the remainder of today, we're going to talk about what ways can racial and cultural stresses also present barriers to this process of our clients trying to attain the goals that they come to therapy for. And as we maybe are equipped with whatever set of therapeutic orientation and the tools within that orientation to help our clients maybe move towards those goals, today we're also going to talk about, well, how do we, if our clients are talking about racial and cultural stresses that are really impactful and presenting obstacles in their day-to-day lives, how do we help our clients heal? How do we help them cope? And if they have to be in these environments where these stresses are kind of continuing and ongoing, how do we help them to endure while they're still trying to make efforts to achieve their goals? Um, Said differently, in a model created by Doctors Rihanna Anderson and Howard Stevenson, whenever racial and cultural stresses show up in our work, show up in our sessions, our clients disclose them to us. I think they have their recast model is a really great tool for creating some like anchor points and some guiding lights for how we can be responsive. So, how do we help our clients to feel comfortable sharing with us what they've noticed in terms of the types of stresses that they've experienced? And then, as you all may appreciate, two people can experience the same type of stress and walk away with different impacts. So, how do we help our clients to communicate to us exactly how they have been or anticipate being impacted by the stresses that they've communicated? And then, this is where we get an opportunity to learn from our clients and celebrate the abilities and resources and the strengths that they've gained from their communities, whether it's from their caregivers or from their friends or from their, just their communities and broadly when it comes to how do they navigate and cope with these impacts. And then also, how do we identify growth opportunities that we as clinicians can, ask permission to be a part of teaching and supporting the growth of these types of abilities and resources. And all of this is in the spirit of helping our clients to develop an I can perspective, a sense of if I am confronted with a certain type of racial and cultural stress, which abilities and resources remain within my control, remain within my access? What can I still do, even when I am confronted with these types of obstacles or these racial and cultural experiences? And I don't want to kind of overpromise anybody or make it seem like, well, it's just on the individual to find the right mixture of abilities and resources to navigate racism and all of its derivatives. I think it is a delicate balance of helping our clients to acknowledge what they can do in the moment while also helping them to grieve and acknowledge the legitimate limitations that these stresses present in their day-to-day life. So we're going to talk about that balance. But ultimately, when that balance is acknowledged, my hope is that there's still some I can that will end up kind of ending up in some sort of decision that somebody can make within that moment. And so we're going to talk about how the reach model or my work kind of helps to provide a more, hopefully a direct and a flexible tool for helping us to, when these types of disclosures come up in our work, kind of to how we can be responsive to all of that. And so, as a little bit of an overview to that, what we're going to do over the next, I guess, roughly 2 hours is talk about how do we acknowledge the racial and cultural stresses and help our clients to disclose them to us. And in my work, I refer to these as the culturally stressful events that somebody may have had before they come to us. Maybe they're happening in while they're engaged in our work with us, or maybe they are anticipated culturally stressful events that they're talking about and that they are concerned about encountering. And then we're going to talk about 3 different ways that cultural stress can impact somebody's life day to day or even over the course of time. And then, much like a decision tree, if our clients are endorsing any of these 3 types of impacts, I put together a little set of like skills or tools that may be indicated depending on the type of stressful impact that the client is disclosing. Okay. So hopefully you can give yourself a pat on the back. I'm going to give myself a pat on the back for my voice making it this far. Taking a sip of water. And now we're on to our next stage of the training. And for those of you who are kind of curious when we're going to take a break, I hope is that we're able to get through this next section and maybe the next 30 to 40 minutes. Then we'll take a break and then we'll resume and get back into it. Okay. So as I mentioned, culturally stressful events are a term that I use to kind of be an umbrella term for the different ways that somebody can feel mistreated, negatively judged, or denied an opportunity because of some aspect of their racial and cultural background. Now, in their day-to-day lives, these types of events can show up in their relationships. So maybe when they're interacting, not just with, people of a different background, but sometimes I've talked to folks who feel very much so impacted by things that their family members or friends or members of their own communities have said that have felt like they were disrespectful or judgmental or felt like a source of being rejected by their own communities as or also being impacted by interactions with other communities. Or sometimes people talk to me whenever they're going into like their different community spaces, whether it's their schools or their jobs or their neighborhoods. And then as soon as they're navigating these spaces, they look at the ways in which they are denied certain opportunities or they lack certain supports or certain resources. And so in my work, I try to listen for these ways in which these types of stressors get attributed to someone's background. And I try to ask for opportunities to explore the impact of those further. But we're going to dig into these types of stressful events a little bit more. And hopefully you may see some examples that maybe some of your clients have endorsed. So, this concept of relationship stressors really kind of embodies some of the key terms that you all may have been exposed to. So, like things like racial microaggressions can often occur interpersonally in interactions. There are also forms of acculturative stresses that people may endure, if they are, in a community that they're not the majority of, they kind of find themselves on the margins of those communities. And so they may find that people may judge whether it's their accents or their any aspects of their differences, and they may feel like they're just not accepted there. And so here are some examples of things that I've heard throughout my career that I would say would fall within this broad category of relationship stressors. And again, things that can be said by people within somebody's community and also outside of their community. So things such as, this is America, we speak English here, or stop acting so white is something that a lot of my teens talk about with that they hear from members within their community, or aren't you supposed to be good at sports, or your hair does not look professional. These are kind of comments or offhanded judgments that people can endure and it can build up and accumulate over time and can have some sort of adverse effect. On the flip side, though, systemic racism or systemic manifestations of these stresses can be much harder to pinpoint. It's really hard to kind of maybe walk. I asked some of the young people that I talk to, like, how often do you walk down the street or walk into your schools or walk into different spaces thinking about the systemic manifestations of how this space came to be and how the people who are in this space ended up being in this space and how the people who are not in this space ended up not being in this space. Like, these aren't maybe typical reflections that people have in their day-to-day life. So what ways can systemic racism and systemic manifestations of these stresses kind of trickle down and affect the day-to-day lives of our clients? Well, I've found that it can be acknowledged through ways in which people feel like certain access to important resources and opportunities are frustrated and denied. And so some of the ways in which that can look, I captured in this graphic here. When somebody says, I noticed that certain laws or policies aren't equally enforced for people who look like me. And that's maybe not just like dealing with law enforcement, but I've also heard maybe students that I work with talking about how when teachers punish certain students, there's an inequity in the severity of the consequence sometimes. Or when a young person talks to me about what they have to study and learn in their curriculum, or even the removal of certain curriculums now that maybe celebrate certain diversity or certain differences. That is a change within their community experiences and the access to certain supports and certain freedoms to be openly who you are. This is not maybe not done directly with any type of relationship, but it's just how the makeup of that community space is changing. And so that's also something that we can be on the lookout for when we are working and talking with our clients. And so one may be thinking, well, how do I even get to this point? Right? I have all these other things to consider whenever I'm talking and sitting across from somebody. Well, I hope that if you're answering that, asking yourself that question, that you get some answers with this slide here. I think it starts with our intake process. One of the things that I try to ask early in the therapeutic process, particularly when I'm taking a social history, and I got this idea from the anxiety disorders, is it the ADIS? Is it anxiety disorders interview schedule? I believe in the child version, when you're taking the interpersonal history, they ask questions about peer victimization, like have you ever felt bullied, teased, left out, rejected, ignored? And then I just added a little kind of qualifier on there due to some part of your identity. And again, I'm making an intentional kind of broad assessment here because I don't want my kind of assumptions about which community somebody is in to be the limiting factor or pigeonholing them or making some aspect of themselves invisible, as we talked about earlier. I want to use language that allows the person to kind of decide which parts of themselves that they can bring to the therapeutic space if they feel like this question was relevant. For when current events come up, and particularly if a current event is happening in the life of your client, and you're not sure if how the client is attributing this, if they're attributing this to like race or culture or some aspect of their identity. So maybe you can kind of use a general prompt like this. For some, these experiences can make somebody question, why are they treating me this way? I'm curious if you've ever thought about this. The person says yes, or no, or whatever. Another follow-up question could be, is there some part of your background that you feel like is connected to this experience? And if the person, again, this is an invitation. If they say, oh, what do you mean? I was like, well, again, sometimes people can think that these types of experiences or something like what you just described has something to do with their background. And, I'm just curious if you feel like that's something you've ever considered. And if the person says no, and if you can explore if they're interested in thinking more about that or if they just want to move on. But I found that questions like this can sometimes open a door and lead to some very fruitful discussions about relationship and community stressors. Or if there's a current event happening in the world whether that's locally or nationally or internationally. And you could say, man, I really recently heard about insert event, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts or feelings about what happened. And has this event had a lasting impact on you since hearing about it? And if so, can maybe you can explore like what is it about this event that has had such a lasting impact? I found that, this also opens the door for people to explore how their empathy, like their compassion for other communities, is also spilling over. So, relationship and community stressors that are affecting other communities can sometimes bleed over into their own day-to-day lives. And that can sometimes be affecting their mental health and their own stress levels. And so, again, it's a great opportunity to kind of assess just broadly how these stressors can be impacting the day-to-day lives of the people we work with. I've also had self-reports be included within the intake paperwork, especially when I'm working in spaces where racism is a common enough endorsement among the work that I do with people. And so for kids, the PRACE is a really great one. It has a screening form and it also is translated into Spanish. And then the Trauma Symptoms of Discrimination scale is a scale that I co-developed with Dr. Monica Williams, that also assessed the ways in which discrimination can load onto anxiety and depression and other mental health kind of experiences. And it doesn't make the assumption that it has to do with race. It asks the person to rate which aspects of their background have felt implicated in the discrimination that they endorsed in the scale. So that can be also very useful. And then the last two is just having tools to be able to broach these subjects. So there's the unrest and the DSM-5 cultural formulation interview if you're looking for some more standardized ways of asking these types of questions. And then the mapping vulnerability and privilege. If you haven't learned of this, this is a visual map of somebody's that you ask your client to draw in session. And it represents all the different resources, all the way from grocery stores to banks to modes of transportation to libraries, and kind of shows hopefully geographically how close and how frequent some of these types of resources are. And then it asks somebody to color coordinate the types of experiences like stresses that they endure in their environment. So you can get a visual representation of where relationship and community stressors may look. And then I also, in the book I recently published, did a slightly different type of map, but the same type of intent is to have somebody represent kind of some of the types of stresses that they are exposed to in a visual representation. Okay, so thus far in our agenda, the goal is hopefully you've kind of gotten some ideas of how you can um, be kind of cultivating this mindset of kind of really being open and respectful and curious about somebody's background. And then also in this last little bit, hopefully got some tips for how you can broach the subject of cultural stress, particularly looking for ways in which somebody's relationships and also their community experiences may have felt uncomfortable and stressful and possibly and those stresses have felt related to some aspect of their background. And now for the remainder of our time, we're going to start thinking about the conceptualization and treatment planning aspect of things. And so, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, the beat diagram, or taking a beat, as I refer to, is a great organizational tool for understanding exactly how the culturally stressful events somebody has endured has impacted them either in that moment or has had a lasting impact on them over the course of time. And so, as the authors Wilson and Gensler kind of talks about in their paper, the ways in which somebody copes with the impacts of racism or racial and cultural stress in this context can be dependent on whether they're really talking about the impact from the past experiences, so things that they've endured in the past and how that's affecting them, or maybe it's in the moment, like they're in the presence of the stress, whether that's an aggressor or an interpersonal experience or in the community space that feels very uncomfortable, like that may present a separate set of needs versus when they're thinking and anticipating what they may endure in the future, that may create a whole separate set of needs. And so, thinking that this beat diagram or just like this translation of thoughts, feelings, and actions, which some of us may be very, very familiar with, this tool can be very helpful in unpacking just how these culturally stressful experiences can create different coping needs depending on whether you're unpacking the past, the present, or the future. And so what we're going to do is think about kind of not just the past, present, or future, but also understand that whenever somebody's talking about these types of stressful events, understanding that the needs that they may be benefiting from in terms of therapeutic support may be dependent on whether their impacts fall within these three categories. And so first, we're going to look at the emotional stress category. One that I would argue, if you do any work related to emotion regulation or dysregulation, a lot of these skills are going to be very familiar because we're not reinventing the wheel here. The needs are still the same. We're just thinking about a way of applying these kind of emotion regulatory skill sets in a way that is responsive and culturally sensitive. So here's a quick case example that we're going to kind of unpack as we go through this particular type of cultural stress impact. So James is an African American 25-year-old cis male who struggles with anxiety and depression. Today, James has walked into your therapeutic office or your therapy office or your virtual space and begins to share that he has felt angrier and more afraid than usual in the days after he learned of a racially motivated murder on social media. James expresses awareness of the murder, awareness that, like, yeah, I know murder happens and this is, really an unfortunate thing. But he's kind of surprised that, this is triggering such a strong emotional reaction for him. And almost like that he's aware that we are often desensitized to these types of news reports, giving kind of like how frequent we hear about these very negative things. And he's kind of surprised that it's kind of getting under his skin a little bit more. So while discussing his emotional reactions with you as his clinician, James is observed as becoming agitated, he's becoming fidgety, and uncharacteristically uncomfortable within the session. And so I would argue, right, that James has acknowledged that he has been exposed to a culturally stressful event. The culturally stressful event in this context is that he is aware that within the communities, whether that community is nationally or more directly his community within the city or the town that he's in, that there is the possibility of violence, that it can be racially motivated. And this is something that he is impacted by. So, if you're thinking about like how this fits so far in the work that we're doing, it's like, how do you broach that subject? How do you bring that up and acknowledge that this is something that, and explore if this is something James would want to explore further? So you could use like some of that language that I mentioned on a couple of slides ago, saying, "Hey, James, I noticed that you just brought up that you were exposed to this unfortunate event on social media. I've read about it. I've heard about it." Or maybe if you haven't heard about it, saying, "You know what, like maybe you don't need to tell me all the details, but I can appreciate that it seems like this is affecting you. I'm curious, have you thought at all about like the lasting impact? Like what are some of the things that you've been feeling over the past few days, since you learned of this event?" And if James is somebody that you've introduced thoughts, feelings, and actions to, you might even ask him to kind of talk through. Come on, James. So maybe you could tell me, like, maybe beyond kind of what you've been feeling the past few days. Maybe you could tell me what you're feeling right now, since you've told me that this is something you've been exposed to. And let's say James, he's already exhibiting signs that his body is impacted by this news. He's agitated, he's fidgety, he's feeling some sense of heightened arousal. He's talked to you, he's disclosed to you he's feeling angrier and more afraid than usual. Maybe he even talks to you a little bit about what that fear and that anger has produced in terms of his actions and urges. And so then in that particular moment in time, you've learned some information about the emotional stress impact of this information. And the question becomes in your head, do I be responsive to that? Do I formulate an intervention for that? Or do I just ignore it and move on and get back to the other stuff that we were talking about? My hope is that you would consult to the client and ask James, like, "Hey, James, is this something that we could take a few moments to talk through and to kind of think about how you've been feeling and maybe think about some things, some next steps. And so if James says, yes, for sure, I'd love to, uh, we'll talk about some other things that we can do. But if you're kind of also wanting to look, what are some other ways that people might show that they are emotionally impacted by culturally stressful events? I put together this diagram to maybe help, us as clinicians, but also the people we work with really unpack these impacts. So on the very bottom level, the safe and secure zone is really kind of thinking about for our clients and maybe even for yourself, who are the people and where are the places where you feel the most relaxed and that you can maybe take a moment, take a beat and notice that that relaxation is evident in your body sensations or maybe even evident in your emotional experiences or even how you carry yourself in those spaces. Or no, said differently, like where are your moments where you have a breath of fresh air? And I find that there are times when I ask people that question, and it definitely breaks my heart, but there are times where people say, I don't have those spaces. And so then that can sometimes become a treatment goal of helping people to explore what those spaces can look like, what expectations they have for those spaces, and be able to track growth towards those spaces. And when you're thinking about exposure to cultural stressful events, i.e., the relationship stressors or the community stressors, sometimes they can create beats that look like the next two levels up. So the fight or flight zone is exactly probably what we all can deduce that that zone may look like, where your body's, sympathetic nervous system is heightened and readying itself for some sort of either physical or social threat. In the context of James, he was talking to me about how when he was going through this case is actually referencing the Buffalo shooting that happened a couple of years ago, that where a white individual aggressed against, shot, murdered a number of black individuals or individuals in a grocery store. And so he was talking about going to the grocery store and noticing himself feeling this heightened arousal, and feeling himself on guard and very vigilant. He noticed himself feeling very worried, very nervous in that context. And he noticed and identified certain action urges, like that vigilance and being very watchful, being on guard in that space. And then on the next level up, there are some times where people are in spaces that where there's ongoing threat, there's ongoing exposure to cultural stress. I've talked to a number of folks who are maybe in certain industries at work, in corporate spaces where there's a constant exposure to whether it's microaggressions or maybe more overt forms of racism or cultural stress that feel inescapable. That there's a numbness that can set in. There's a sense of sadness or hopelessness and a level of inactivity that can set in those types of spaces. But my hope is that that if you look at this, that you can maybe help your clients maybe map out like what are their responses in each of these zones so that there's an increased knowledge of how these cultural stresses can impact them. Okay, so now as you see in the bottom right hand corner, if you notice that your clients have disclosed some sort of culturally stressful experience like James has really kind of created an openness or accepted your invitation to really process and talk through their emotional responses to these events, here are some kind of options to keep in mind. Again, many of these will sound very familiar because I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel, but just having some different terminology. So this will be very familiar. So we'll probably go through this pretty quickly. So the empowered responding is a set of kind of exercises that I try to help people to think through their responses to these stressful moments. As it's been commonly endorsed that sometimes people's urges that they feel when they're maybe have experiencing that heightened arousal or that heightened emotional intensity can sometimes cause them to respond or react in ways that they later find that they're either not proud of or that maybe creates more struggle for them a little bit later. And so we try to think through what are some ways to kind of navigate and think through those immediate responses and to kind of find ways to respond to these moments in ways that they're proud of, both in them and after the moment has passed. Soothing efforts is just another way of talking about the stress tolerance or different ways of kind of soothing your mind and your body and your emotions, not with the idea of trying to rid yourself of these emotions, but really, as we'll talk about, to ride the wave of these feelings. And then filling the wellness buckets is my adaptation and application of behavioral activation in these contexts. We're really thinking about certain routines that people and responsibilities that people can continue trying to keep focusing on and investing on as they heal from these types of experiences. So for James, whenever this happened in the session, I kind of stopped the processing very abruptly and asked if we could engage in a soothing effort together because it was very clear to me that the agitation and the fidgetiness that he was having in that moment, it was having a hard time really staying in this conversational format because he had really gotten he was starting to get dysregulated in his form of what that looked like. And I wanted to offer a way to kind of a regulatory activity and then revisit our discussions after he had found a greater sense of control of his emotional experience. And so when it comes to soothing efforts, really, if I have the opportunity when I'm talking to people, maybe not for James, but outside of the context, if I'm asking them to practice soothing efforts, I try to clarify to them this idea of riding the wave and the expectations. I don't know if you all have had this sense where you suggest to somebody practice breathing or progressive muscle relaxation or some sort of distress tolerance tool, and they come back and they say, this didn't work, doc. I still felt uncomfortable. Well, the idea is if they're expecting immediate relief or a complete kind of fixing of their emotional experience, well, that's not really realistic or validating of the true kind of nature of the stressor they're enduring. So we try to kind of talk through what these types of efforts will accomplish and what they won't. And then we try to think about brain sort of different self-soothing or soothing efforts that somebody can make. So in the context of cultural stress, this is a acronym that I co-developed with one of my colleagues, Dr. Laura Gallo, called Sticking to the Basics. And it's really kind of a summary of different types of soothing efforts that our clients can try to think through, especially when they're navigating the effects of cultural stresses. So body focused coping, which are things that we maybe naturally teach for other types of stresses. I also talk about activism as a way of also channeling some of the rage and the anger that you may feel towards some of the injustices, particularly that you may feel within either certain spaces that you feel less control over. We'll talk about that in after the break. Seeking social support, I find that this one is really important to lean on and not necessarily identifying the who, like who you can talk to, but also asking people like, have they ever spent time using I feel statements or opening up or, have they, how would they even feel about acknowledging their feelings? And I find that for some folks, if they feel like, doing so is just going to be adding a burden to someone else, or they really haven't cultivated that type of intimacy within their relationships, then that may also need to be a treatment goal down the road is to, maybe you can't utilize this as a resource right now, but what things can we be doing over the course of time to help make that an option in the future? Calming activities, I'll get to investing in self in a second, but calming activities are really like the self-soothe kit type things that we might use from DBT skills, but really thinking carefully about what activities and things might people be able to use to kind of temporarily kind of refocus their attention away from their distress so they give their bodies and their minds enough time to kind of regulate a bit. And then spiritual connection for many communities of color, like their connection to a higher power, to God, is a very much so a grounding and meaningful way of navigating strife and navigating obstacles. And so that's something that you may want to check in about to see if that's something that they can also be accentuated within the therapeutic process. You will also see this in your slides. This is um, I'd like to celebrate the youth in the Bronx, New York that I used to work with. They helped me to put this together, and I asked them kind of when might you think you might benefit from seeking support, and these are some of the things that they put together. And so I now use this as a checklist for people so that instead of just talking about who they could talk to, it's also a tool to help them to kind of self-identify when they might benefit from talking to their supportive networks. So in addition to helping James with like the regulatory skills in that particular session, I believe we engaged in some sort of breathing exercise to help him to kind of down regulate, if I remember correctly. The other piece that, I noticed is that this sense of fear was creating some avoidance urges. And I'm not here to kind of check the facts on, where is it safe or not safe to be after an incident like this that he was exposed to, but really kind of trying to lean on some of the values that he has and some of the things that he's trying to attain in his life, and trying to think of what routines and responsibilities does he want to fight to try to keep as he's trying to kind of make sense of that event that happened at that time. And so again, this adaptation of behavioral activation, I ask folks to think of like when you've been exposed to a culturally stressful event, like which of these buckets or these areas of your life do you feel tempted or do you feel like it's hard to keep up with? And so then I try to help folks to kind of figure out which of these buckets may be running low or may be challenging to engage in. And then we do some activity scheduling, or in here, we create a wellness plan of how you can try to invest efforts into these buckets, even as you're still trying to heal from the stressful experiences you've encountered. And then last but not least, we have empowered responding. So again, this is looking at the relationship between someone's emotions and their action urges and trying to do these three steps. So trying to normalize that like certain action urges are going to come up when you're exposed to certain culturally stressful experiences, with a statement like, often when people feel anxious and have thoughts like, I don't know if this person is going to hurt me or if this person is going to be kind to me. It can make an urge like going to the grocery store, going out into your community very strong, or avoidance very strong. Inviting self-compassion. How might these action urges make sense for the type of cultural stress that is affecting you or that can affect anyone? Well, it might make sense because that event, it's nonsensical. These people were just going through their day-to-day lives, and then somebody decided that this was not that they were going to have and enact this type of event. It's just so hard to wrap my mind around. So of course I'm going to be anxious. So of course I'm going to not know where the threat may lie. And so then invite exploration of alternate responses to avoidance. Are you interested in exploring other types of responses to these thoughts or emotions? How are these actions helping you right now? Or, these urges helping you? Or are there any ways in which they are not helping you? So notice I'm not saying that's adaptive, that's maladaptive, or, you shouldn't do that. Shame, or using sometimes overly clinical language, but it's really helping the person to kind of weigh in this moment in time, like how these responses may or may not be benefiting them, and trying to think carefully in that moment in time, because it has not necessarily for James, it had not manifested into some bigger kind of pattern of behavior that was ruining his life or into creating impairment. It was really that acute stress reaction that was trying to help him to think through. And so these are questions that can be helpful in helping our clients to think through that as well. So thus far, we've talked about work that we can be doing before we have conversations related to culturally stressful events. We've talked about ways to make space for culturally stressful events and the work that we do in terms of encouraging those disclosures. And then after those disclosures are made, we just got finished talking about noticing and recognizing the emotional impacts of those stresses, and then also how we can be responsive in supporting somebody. Now we're going to talk about two additional ones, two additional ways that we can be responsive to the needs that somebody may have if they endorse these types of experiences. And so right now we're going to talk about agency stress. So agency stress is really kind of came up when I was thinking, like, apart from just helping someone to kind of navigate the emotional experience, there's this wrestling with power or control or impact that somebody has whenever they are confronted with these stresses. It's this sense of not feeling sure, what can I do or what can I say, or how can I go about trying to change, correct, or improve the surroundings. And the time, and when I noticed, and this is actually rooted in my dissertation from graduate school, when people have what is called a challenge appraisal, or they appraise the situation as having something within their control, it actually is quite protective against some of the impacts of the stress that they endure. But whenever somebody feels stuck in the I can't, or being unsure of being able to how they can navigate or address the stress that's in front of them, that can really perpetuate and deepen the emotional impact of the work that I mean of the stress that they're exposed to. So aside from just helping someone navigate the impacts of that stress, it's also important that we explore their sense of, do they feel like they have tools within their toolkit or resources around them to stand up against the stresses that they feel exposed to. And if the answer to that is no, then that can be really painful for them. And so the ways in which that can look in their beat is coming across as I can't thinking. So, when they're talking about the sources of stress, whether that's comments that somebody has made, or the inability to kind of uh, be promoted or gain access to a certain type of career, or if they're talking about just other types of cultural experiences that are happening in our country right now and politically, and there's a sense of like acknowledging the pain associated with those stresses, but then there's something about like I can't do anything about it that keeps coming up for them. Well, that is maybe a sign, a light bulb can go off of, wow, this person may be wrestling with, what can I do? What agency do I have? Also when somebody's struggling with agency, sometimes that can look like avoidance. So I've learned while doing this work is that, sometimes we can go straight to the emotional implications of avoidance, like, oh, this person must be feeling shame or anxiety, and that's what's causing them to avoid. But sometimes that avoidance can be their only semblance of control or power that that person feels that they have. I've had that happen with school refusal with some of the kids that I work with when they're not showing up to their classes or being very avoidant of going to the school building, that sometimes it can be related to the lack of agency they feel like they have over the type of treatment they received in that building from a cultural context. But on the flip side, there are I refer to them as the social justice warriors, or the people who fight, the squeaky wheels, the people who are always, on the different committees or on the different kind of at the forefront of all of the initiatives that is going on in their community space. Those individuals may also be struggling with agency. It may, on the outside, they may look agency stress. On the outside, they may look like, oh, this person has all the hope in the world and has all the fight in the world. But underneath, they may be struggling with, exhaustion and fatigue, and even feeling a sense of hopelessness. Is this even matter? Is this even, does my efforts even matter? Is it even amounting to anything? And then there's sometimes that shame can come up, or guilt. If somebody's like noticed that they wanted to say something or they wanted to do something, but they didn't stand up, or they didn't uh, make an effort to try to promote change or try to address the source of the stress they're in. This constellation of experiences within the beat, I have kind of referred to as being connected to this wrestling with agency that is, slightly different. It represents a slightly different set of needs than what we talked about just a few moments ago before the break. And so here's a quick case example, one that is not maybe as clinically has as much clinical language as the previous case example, but one that can be just an everyday thing that can come up, but that can be an example of agency stress. So let's say that you have a young person who is really focused on like being more confident and being more expressive. And, let's say this is a person who struggles maybe with social anxiety, if you want to kind of have a clinical context to it. And let's say Victor is hanging out and listening to music with his friends, and they pass him the phone or to kind of choose the next song, like on Spotify or Apple Music. And after his song plays, they start clowning him or making fun of him or teasing him and saying, "Bro, your taste is whack. This is some white people music." Now, in that particular moment, this may seem like harmless teasing and not that big a deal, but remember, this is a kid who's maybe a little bit more attuned to this type of like critique or rejection of his interests. And then even if he wasn't, that could be something that can get underneath anybody's skin if they were addressed as in this way by their friends. Now, apart from the emotional impact of this, Victor is left with this question of, do I try to address my friends and kind of stand up to them and let them know that this is not something that I appreciate, which I refer to as a change effort, trying to change, correct, or improve the culturally stressful environment that I'm in. And the question is does, Victor choose that response? And also, one of the things that we can be thinking about is like what might influence whether Victor feels even willing to check his friends or to engage in a change response or a change effort. Because even though you're in that moment and you may even know what to say or what you could say, there could be other factors that may still create the sense of I maybe shouldn't or I can't speak up or do anything to address the source of stress that I'm confronted with. So these are some questions that I might consider for Victor. If I was sitting across from him, I'd say, what are some skills or traits or abilities that might help Victor feel as if he can stand up for himself? So when Victor is in a situation like that, does he see himself as having the words to say or the characteristics or the charisma or the personality that would even stand up to a source of this type of stress? Or does he feel like he has the support around him that would give him the encouragement to, or the confidence to be able to stand up for himself? Or does Victor feel alone? Or does he feel more isolated? Does he feel like if he was to speak up, he would be the only one in his corner? And then also, are there any other consequences or costs that Victor is considering that might influence whether he can or can't, feels he can or can't speak up to his friends? Right. So this matrix or this kind of table here is kind of how Victor might answer these questions in a way that could either sway him towards saying, nope, I can't say anything, or I can. So for the personal abilities, right? Does he feel like he has certain traits or abilities? Maybe if he thought, man, I could say something because I'm quick with my comebacks. Like maybe he thinks that I'm somebody who's, witty, quick, is witty and very kind of can, go tit for tat, very kind of with his responses. Or maybe he's, kind of sees himself as like, I don't really have those skills. I can't say anything. I'll just choke and freeze under the pressure. And then let's another level down, even if he does feel like he has the comebacks and the abilities and the kind of knowledge of himself to be able to respond in these ways, does he feel supported in that space? And so let's say, he doesn't. He say, even if I say something, I'll be alone. None of my friends will have my back. Or he might say, I can say something because I know at least one of my friends will have my back. And even if that's the case, he maybe feels supported and he does feel like he has the comebacks that he could say. Maybe there are some cost benefit analysis that he has to do. So maybe on the I can't side, I can't say anything because if I do, I'll probably lose it and ruin the friendship. So in his head, he's like, yeah, I know that I could say something and I know I'm supported, but I can see myself really saying some mean things and I don't want to jeopardize my friendships. Or he may have found a way to manage the cost benefit analysis in a way that still protects the benefits. I want to say something even if they don't like it. They need to know I'm not feeling that type of response. So I have a version of this in my book, but I found that this graphic really, for anybody who's struggling, whether it's with the current political climate or with any type of cultural stresses, and they're really wrestling with their sense of agency, I've used these types of questions to really kind of pinpoint kind of how someone is processing what feels within their control and maybe even helps them to understand why they maybe haven't taken any action because of some of these different I can'ts reasons here. So I found that this could be a really helpful processing tool if somebody feels kind of stuck and unsure why they haven't taken action in some of these situations. So let's say that you are working with someone like Victor or someone who is kind of struggling with what do I do in response to the stresses that I'm faced with? In the work that I do, particularly in this part of the decision tree, there's two options. It's helping individuals kind of make change efforts. As it says here, these are individuals where somebody tries to change or correct people or places responsible for cultural stress or trying to improve their surroundings or their communities. Sometimes it's by confronting and using their voices or seeking advocacy or support or using social actions. Or if somebody finds, as it says here, that like the costs seem too great and it's quite challenging to change the things, and there's not really enough bandwidth to be able to invest these efforts into change right now, then what else still remains within their control? So that's the resilience efforts. So we're going to start with change efforts and we'll talk about that briefly. So making change efforts. One question that I sometimes like to ask is like, what are the goals that you want to pursue for change? There's a lot that someone can feel frustrated with. So even for Victor, right, what is it that he hopes that his efforts, if he were to take the time and the energy to try to address his friends, what is he hoping that he can accomplish? Is it that he wants to make sure that if he does share something about his interests again, that they're more respectful, that they're more supportive? Is it that they just don't ever ask him to share his interests anymore? Like, what is it that he's hoping to accomplish with if he were to, try to address them? Versus another context, maybe the focus isn't on the relationship or any dynamic of the relationship, but maybe it's about what's offered in the community. I've had individuals talk to me about maybe different affinity spaces that they want to try to create in a space to create more inclusion, or they want to just offer spaces to be help spaces to be more supportive or encouraging or something along those lines. So really helping the person to kind of think through, if you were to try to make a change effort, what would you hope to accomplish with these efforts? And then based upon the goal or goals that they have, be helping them to brainstorm what efforts can help you to make reasonable steps towards this type of change. And so here's a grid of different types of statements that I use whenever I'm kind of doing groups or talking to folks. It's like a menu of options. And on one hand, on the left-hand side, it's like encouraging others to treat you fairly by setting certain boundaries. And on the right-hand side, it's educating others, sharing information about yourself or your background that is corrective, right? It's checking them with their misinformation. And you will also notice that some of these are statements and some of these are questions. So for example, if somebody were to approach you and say, I don't like when you do that, please don't do or say that again. Or the alternative is if somebody were to cut in front of you, how would you respond if somebody cut in front of you just like you did? So that puts the responsibility on the other person rather than having you to having the individual have to come up with this very poignant kind of big statement, but really kind of having the other person be put on the hot seat instead. So if you were to, whenever I do this type of kind of deliberation about statements that can be said, I treat this as like a brainstorming list. This is not like tried and true, empirically tested statements that work in all environments. This is like, hey, tell me, what do you think about these? Does these sound like you? How would you change them? How would you edit them? How would you make them more in your voice? What are you concerned would happen if you were to express these types of things? What are some ways that maybe you can practice confidently stating these statements that feel more like your voice? And then maybe we might role play them and help them to kind of practice hearing themselves say these in these different types of situations so that hopefully that addresses the concern of like, oh, I don't feel like I have the ability to confront this person. Well, if we work on that and work on helping somebody have the language, then that can maybe reduce that as an I can't. The second area is really thinking about allyship and seeking support. There are times where certain people around you may have greater privilege and less to risk if they were to speak up and stand up with you or stand up on your behalf. And so this is like a menu of options of different characteristics that somebody might look for in terms of identify what might be a good ally, what might be somebody, what might be some qualities that I might look for to take the risk and see if I can trust this person. And then it's kind of helping the person to identify who those people are, and then helping them to kind of come up with the language of kind of communicating what they're looking for, what their needs are within advocacy. And then last but not least is helping individuals to brainstorm what social action and activism can look like. Um, there are oftentimes there's a lot of negativity broadcast in the news, a lot of criminalizing of activism. And the goal here would be to help people to see that there's a menu of ways in which you can try to improve or address some of the concerns within your community. And so I try to also help people to look at their strengths. So if we go back to the who am I diagram, look at some of the types of abilities and the resources that somebody has access to, and then try to think about within your strengths, how can you use those to align with some of the options for participating in activism? And so this kind of helps to enhance the brainstorming quality here if we're able to align it with somebody's interests and or their strengths. But I should caution this, everything I've said so far, yes, it's about setting the goals and it's about brainstorming, but there are some things that also, to be sensitive and responsive, we need to be also asking if this was an intervention we were going to engage in. So if somebody's very gung-ho about engaging in change efforts, I try to also encourage them to think through what are some of the costs of fighting for change. So sometimes fighting for change can come with social costs. Social costs can be like the loss of friendship, the loss of, social, or causing of being exposed to rejection or negative judgments or perceptions. And it's not necessarily say this is to deter anybody because these costs could occur or could exist, but it's also helping them to be aware of them so that they can cope ahead for how they might respond if these were to be things they are confronted with. Resource costs, so being losing access to housing, to jobs, to kind of different sources of support because of somebody being more vocal or being more active with kind of their wants and their needs and their demands for how a community needs to change or a relationship needs to change. Again, not to deter somebody from doing this, but to make them be very thoughtful about the impacts that this can have and help them to kind of, if possible, cope ahead for some of the ways that this could affect their life. Safety, and thinking about, are there ways in which this can cause physical harm or threaten harm to the individual? And then also the emotional cost, is whether that's, the emotional cost of the anxiety about worrying about engaging in these things, or the frustration, or the toll that it may take seeing your efforts not lead to the things that you want them to lead to. There's kind of, or, are you the only one that's really fighting all the time and nobody else is really sharing the burden? Like, let's think about the emotional cost that can come with, and again, coming up with a plan to kind of cope ahead. And then also, I think it's important to acknowledge that even though there is strength, and oftentimes strength is aligned with this idea of fighting, that it can also be very empowering and be responsible at times to respect that this is costly, and that sometimes maybe not making a change effort could be in someone's best interest. And so sometimes normalizing that at that moment in time might be the healthiest and most supportive thing for that person, and allowing them to kind of talk about how that, rests in there, or how that help them to process that possibility, could also be really informative as well. But as I acknowledged before, and as we just got finished talking about, sometimes the fight for change is either long and arduous, and or it's so costly that people are like, I don't know if I want to put the time and the energy into that. But that doesn't necessarily protect you from feeling powerless or feeling hopeless or feeling as if I don't have any agency. And so when I was thinking about this other alternative to change efforts, I also go back to some of my research where, some of the individuals had that challenge appraisal, or that feeling like I have a sense of control, by also feeling like maybe I can't change this person or change this space, but I can still feel in control of where I'm trying to achieve and where I'm trying to get to. And so I wanted to channel that type of date, that sentiment from my data into also a coping option in my work as well. So how that might look is kind of exposing people to different types of goals, what I refer to as resilience goals, whether that's within their relationships with like family, friends, romantic partners, or in professional or collegial kind of relationships. Thinking about wellness goals that somebody may still be very invested in within their emotional health, their physical health, spiritual or community health. And then also helping someone to think about from an achievement standpoint, things that they still may want to attain, whether that's in their academic setting, their work setting, or possibly there's some personal growth goals they have, or some leisure things in their life that they're trying to work towards. And all of this is not to say that, um, cultural stress should be ignored and should not be that big of a deal, but it's to acknowledge that like there are still things that are within your control to attain. And I think if this is a hard sell for some people, but people are really attuned to different historical examples. There's a lot of examples in different civil rights struggles or different historical eras where people were marginalized and treated pretty negatively, where they tried to still practice resilience in this way by creating their own communities, creating their own schools, creating their own spaces to live and to have places of self-respect and where places where they could have that autonomy and control. And so there are examples where, you can also point to kind of give people some examples that, this is something that is also historically rooted within their communities, if that is like a necessary kind of tool for kind of broaching this type of intervention. But apart from the brainstorming process of like what goals do you have and how you can maybe pursue these goals in each of these domains, I think it's also important to kind of bring cultural stress back into the mix and think about like even if you have your best goal of your, very smart goals like of achieving certain in school or achieving something in your career and your relationships, kind of coming back to how might cultural stress frustrate that effort? And then what can you do to still support your resilience efforts if cultural stress does that? And this is where I bring from some different aspects of literature, different tools that people have been using for much longer than I've been alive in terms of navigating the sources of stress that they face and still, you know, pursuing these goals. And so one is information seeking, right? When you go into a space or you are meeting someone new, and you're still trying to figure out charting your path forward, gathering information from those people, from the people within that space. And a great example of this is, I always tell the story of a good friend of mine now, but at the time when we first met, it was a colleague of mine who had just came to a place where I was working. And she is a black psychologist and asked to meet with me to kind of ask a little bit about kind of the lay of the land in the clinic that she had just joined that I had been working at for a little bit longer than she had. And this was her way of saying, like I came to this clinic because I had certain career goals. And I've, have my path forward for those goals, but I'm also trying to get some data, some information as to how do I best navigate this space so that I can still feel within control of my pursuit of my goals. Selective energy and effort is really helping people to think through, while you may have to remain in certain spaces like your jobs or your neighborhoods or your schools or so forth, that feel culturally stressful, and you have to be in those spaces to attain the goals that you're really working to attain. Maybe are there ways to be very thoughtful and selective about how much energy and effort you're investing in those spaces? And so there are some examples on the right here about how people can be thoughtful about that. And then last but not least is really kind of maintaining supportive networks outside of that space. And so this can be extremely hard if somebody feels isolated and alone. And so it may be something like, having a session where you spend some time going online and looking up different supportive communities or networks or professional networks to help people to kind of brainstorm whether any of these are accessible to them and may feel supportive. And if people do have these spaces, really kind of encouraging to be intentional about scheduling meetings and check-ins to make sure that they're being still supported, even if they're in their direct community spaces, they're not. And then, as a form of just kind of celebrating progress towards goals, really creating a plan of really trying to pursue these goals, but then also tracking and celebrating the efforts towards them as a way of reminder that yes, I'm still doing something with my time and my energy and my effort to pursue something meaningful, even in a culturally stressful space. Okay. All right, so we're getting there. We're almost there. The last component of my model here is identity stress. So again, apart from, when somebody discloses or acknowledges the experience of culturally stressful events, either in their relationships or their community spaces, and aside from the emotional weight that that may bring, or the wrestling with agency and control and influence that they may have, there's also this internal dialogue that they are also maybe struggling with in terms of their relationship to their background, how they think and feel about being a part of their community, and just acknowledging how the world around them, excuse me, and the messages that come from these culturally stressful experiences can be warping or making it hard to have love and pride and appreciation for being a part of that community. And so this is another impact that I also want to be listening for if people disclose that they've experienced cultural stress. So here's an example of how this could look. Jasmine is a Black teen adopted by white parents. She attends a school in a predominantly white neighborhood. One day she walks into your office wearing a baggy hoodie with the hood up and covering her hair and forehead. While discussing her choice in attire, she shares that some of her classmates have recently been making hurtful jokes about her forehead. When you talk to her about the beat reactions, so her body sensations, her emotions, her actions, and thoughts in response to these events were related to her classmates' comments, she mentions, I don't like being Black anymore, and I want to do whatever I can to not stand out. So again, as you can maybe deduce from looking at this case example, you can imagine that maybe she's hurting. Maybe she's feeling anxious about going into the school space. Maybe she maybe is wrestling also with feeling like, what can I say or do to make these people, my classmates stop saying such hurtful things about myself? But that's not where the impact stops. There's also a way in which these comments have started to seep in to how she thinks and feels about herself. And I wanted to make sure that in a model that I use to guide and be intentional about how to be responsive in these moments, that I'm also asking questions and looking for ways in which this could be affecting somebody's identity development as well. And so, what I refer to is identity stress moments, or moments when somebody is struggling with self love, self confidence, and cultural pride. It can look like in their thoughts, right? They're communicating that they have a presence of self dislike, self doubt, or cultural shame, which we'll talk about in a slides, 2 slides. Or they're struggling to have any love or confidence or pride in who they are. And maybe that is reflected in their actions because of this struggle with love and confidence and pride. They're either hiding and concealing an aspect of themselves, as we saw with Jasmine. They're either avoiding or trying to escape certain experiences where they may be reminded of these types of negative messages around them, or made to feel really uncomfortable about being who they are. Or they may be tempted to posture or pose as if they either like different things, or maybe tempted to just kind of deny this aspect of themselves altogether. And so I, how I kind of think a little bit about kind of the thought aspect of this is, I think about it as identity self-talk, or the conversations that someone has to themselves about an aspect of their identity. And of course, in my work, as you may have already noticed so far, it's heavily focused on race and ethnicity. But I've also used this idea of identity self-talk to think about how people may feel and think about other aspects of their identity as well. And I also should acknowledge that, we're not going to get into this as much, but culturally mindful moments are my way of also acknowledging that there are some people who may not be able to kind of identify their identity self-talk readily when you ask them, because it does take time for somebody to have spent some time thinking about this aspect of their identity in space and time. And so, one of the activities that sometimes precedes this conversation about identity self-talk is asking people to think about in their day-to-day life when they ever think about a particular part of their identity, like their race. And I have a grid that I don't have in this talk here, but a grid of like is, different prompts that can bring up these thoughts, whether it's different TV shows or movies or music or social media or being in a certain setting like a school or faith-based organization or being around certain people like your family, your friends, your romantic partner and really having people kind of go on this journey of thinking when and where do I think about this part of my identity? And then without judgment or without categorization, just having them take a beat and notice whenever they are aware of this part of their identity, what are they thinking about? What are they feeling? And how does it affect their actions? And so from that type of exercise, you may be able to get some information about kind of patterns within their identity self-talk. So whenever they are more aware of this part of themselves, do they ever have, in this case, moments where they have self-acceptance, pride, and love? And so some examples of how that can look in those moments are self-love thoughts might be, man, whenever this person says, I looked in the mirror and I saw my skin, or I was outside and under the sun and I saw how my skin had kind of bronzed and kind of was like shining and glimmering. I felt like, man, I look beautiful. My skin is beautiful. Well, that would be an example of a part when a part of their background is accentuated and brought to their awareness, that awareness is met with a sense of love and a warm and kind and affirming self-talk. Or another way in which I talk about kind of positive identity self-talk is in the context of self-confidence. So going back to the strengths and the abilities that somebody may feel that they have, especially the strengths and abilities that are connected to their community, their cultural community, is that they are able to acknowledge that these strengths have value and meaning and that they can use them in a very important way. Like, I have what it takes to get to where I want to be, or the lessons I've learned from my community will help me get through this. These are moments where they're acknowledging an aspect of how their abilities are connected to their community, and it's giving them confidence that they want to utilize them in a way that feels meaningful. And then last but not least is cultural pride, is moments where somebody is aware that they are a part of their community. Whether, I think about this story of this, a young girl that during the Olympics, and I was meeting with her in my 6 p.m. slot, and she was like, Dr. Ryan, I got to get home because Simone Biles is about to go on TV, and I want to get home to watch her. And so this is like an 8-year-old who was telling me this, but at that moment in time, I was able to appreciate that there's something that's exciting about seeing somebody with her same skin complexion and her same gender being able to do such amazing things that it brought her a sense of pride that she wanted to go home, rush home, and participate in watching that with her family. And so this is a sense of really thinking about the moments in which our clients may feel like a sense of pride and gratitude for being a part of their community and being thoughtful about what those moments may be that bring up that sense of pride. And then, of course, this is not an exhaustive list. So you may inquire, like, are there other moments in time where other ways in which they may think about or feel positively towards their identities that don't neatly fall within these three categories? You can also help them to communicate that to you as well. Now, on the flip side, there's also moments where somebody's awareness of a part of themselves, as we saw with the example with Jasmine on the in the case example, where because of certain experiences socially or certain sources of cultural stress or exposures to certain stereotypes, prejudices, and discrimination, that has inspired negative self-talk or critical and judgmental perspectives towards one's racial and cultural background. And so for Jasmine, there was some examples of self-dislike, having when being reminded of her skin complexion or being reminded of her facial features, there was a very negative and critical perspective of this, a disliking of being a part of this, of having these features. Or maybe there's self-doubt where somebody maybe ignores or criticizes or undervalues certain strengths that they bring to the table. I think about individuals, there's a case that I'm supervising now of somebody who is um, multilingual, but as a part of their being multilingual, they are more kind of focused on the fact that their ability to speak different languages also makes them speak English with an accent. And so aside from them having like this dislike of having an accent, there's also this sense of feeling like a sense of doubt that, they are able to use like the strength of being able to be multilingual in their place of business. Like they actually don't, they see that as a negative attribute, as something that isn't going to help them towards their goals in that space, as being a manager and a leader in that space. And rather they see that as something that they want to mute, and that is something that should be avoided. And so really thinking about, like, are there moments and times where your clients maybe attribute certain abilities or certain experiences to their cultural groups, and instead of seeing that with pride and with confidence that they want to share that, they see it with doubt and something that should be avoided or should be concealed. And that would be something that we could be on the lookout for and could be a sign of identity stress. And then shame is kind of the other end of the spectrum of pride when it comes to moments where somebody feels like a sense of shame or a lack of gratitude or appreciation for being affiliated or assumed to be affiliated with a particular group or with their community. And so I should acknowledge that these negative identity self-talk kind of components are not, I don't see them as uh, necessarily like thinking errors or thinking traps or cognitive distortions that we have to just immediately try to correct with, like, dispute questions or counterfactual evidences. But sometimes it's helpful to even starting off by saying, how did we get here? Like, what are some of the ways in which, what are some of the messages that you've been exposed to that might kind of make it make sense that these thoughts may be also a part of your experience, right? And then also at the same time, helping individuals to appreciate that it's not an all or nothing. You can have moments of self-love, but then in the next 10 minutes be exposed to something and have a moment of self-dislike. So these are not kind of like categorical, like either somebody is all the time in one or in the other. I've seen it be very dependent upon how the environment shifts and what kind of experiences somebody's exposed to in terms of how these types of thought processes change. And so I just want to be careful with like pathologizing these aspects of someone's thinking, because sometimes it's really just a very naturalistic way in which somebody is responding to an environment that is communicating some negativity towards themselves or their background. So then what can we do with these types of in these types of situations to support our clients? And also, why is there a scorecard on the screen? So one of the analogies that I use to kind of talk about this, is particularly if there's a sports, somebody with the sports metaphor, is thinking about how whenever we're working through identity stress, we need an offensive and a defensive game plan. We need tools that are helping us to grow and strengthen. That's our offensive game plan, our positive identity self-talk. We need like things that our families are maybe exposing us to, or that we're intentionally exposing ourselves to, that helps to remind us of things that we love and appreciate and take pride in terms of who we are. And that doesn't have to be only when cultural stress is prompted. It can be done proactively, and it often is in many families. But then at the same time, whenever we're confronted with cultural stresses like Jasmine, we also need a way to protect ourselves and to heal from the negative self-talk that we may be having and the social messages that are kind of maybe prompting these types of thinking. So I'm going to go through in our last little bit of time how each of these three different types of intervention approaches can kind of either be a way of building up the positive identity self-talk, or a way of protecting and healing from the negative identity self-talk. So exploration and expression are all about discovering the parts of ourselves that we feel proud of and that we love, but then also proudly and hopefully confidently expressing these parts of ourselves in a way that then creates this feedback loop into reminding ourselves that this is something we love and we're confident in and we feel proud of. while something that I refer to as identity protection is talks about tools for helping someone to acknowledge that the world around them is not always kind or supportive. And so sometimes we need skills to be able to help us to protect our self-love and the self-confidence and the pride that we have or that we're trying to grow. And so we'll go in order, but the blue highlights the things that I hypothesize and that I've seen can grow positive identity self-talk. So identity exploration here, this is a grid of different activities that I kind of organized that people can do by themselves, with their friends and family, or in their community with the intent of trying to explore and learn what they love about themselves. Now, some may say, oh, this is an activity that's only for children or teenagers or younger individuals. But I would argue that anytime that anybody, including adults, transitions to a new stage of life or transitions to a new area, maybe they move, that there's a renegotiation in this new space of who am I going to be? How am I going to express myself? What are the most important parts of myself that I want to showcase? And so there may be an exploration process that needs to take place, and so this can also be seen as a way to help people when they're transitioning or adjusting to new spaces to explore kind of what in this new space brings me a sense of self-love, self-confidence, and cultural pride. And then aside from just doing the activities in that grid, I also like to kind of encourage people to do some intentional self-reflection after they do these activities. Self-reflection encourages them to like think about, was there anything new or unsuspected that they were exposed to, anything inspiring or that made them feel proud, anything that they disagreed with or that they were uncomfortable with that was, presented as being a part of their cultural experience. And then was there anything that they want to add or update in their who am I diagram because of some of the things that they were exposed to? And then also, did they discover anything about their self-love, their self-confidence, or cultural pride? You don't have to do all of these self-reflection questions. Sometimes only assigned one of them, but it's helping people to do these activities, but then also be intentional in terms of unpacking the influence that these activities might have had on their lives. Identity expression, again, is about taking the things that you feel confident in or that you feel are an important reflection of who you are and finding ways to showcase or express them in your day-to-day life. So, in the context of racial and ethnic identity, these are some different ways in which I wanted to help people to brainstorm how they could be expressing this aspect of themselves, their racial and ethnic background. And of course, this doesn't necessarily. I had a conversation with a client a couple of weeks ago about how I really don't like the term authentic self-expression because I really find when I'm talking to people about this that self-expression is truly a privilege. And being authentically yourself often assumes that you're just 100% just like unapologetically just doing, you know, you know, uh, showcasing all these aspects of yourself without concern for how people might respond. And I don't always find that that is in the best interest of people, given the sources of cultural stress that they've been exposed to. So for me, I ask people to look at this list as almost like an aspirational list, like things that they hope that they can find as many spaces in their environment that they can kind of present themselves, and showcase their identities in a way that feels confident for them. And then we kind of process some additional material information like, all right, so as you're trying to figure out where it feels comfortable and safe for you to present yourself in these ways, kind of what are some of the costs that you may feel are associated with that. And so, again, we went through these same terms in the agency stress section, so I'm not going to go over them in more detail, but it's really kind of helping them to think about the social costs, the resource and safety and emotional costs that can influence kind of how they're deciding who and where is the safest person to express myself as fully as I think I can with them. And then I also try to think instead of it being an all or nothing of either I am completely 100% myself or I'm hiding and concealing who I am, I wanted to create these three different domains. So open expression often aligns with the people and the places in your environment where you feel like you can just be you can remove as many filters of yourself as possible. It's like kind of aligns within the emotional stress section where I talked about the safe and secure zone. So really thinking about where are those safe and secure zones that people maybe find, whether it's at work or with certain colleagues or when it's at home behind closed doors or when you're with certain groups of people that you could talk a certain type of way with and kind of truly let your hair down, kind of really helping them to identify what does open expression look like for you in that space. How might you talk? How might you dress? How might you present yourself when you feel like you have that freedom? Versus whenever you're aware that there are certain costs associated with self-expression that maybe you don't want to necessarily be confronted with, right? What does selective expression look like? And I always share this story, like whenever I got into move from working in the Bronx in a space where I felt like having locks and having my a certain way of presenting myself was actually celebrated in a source of connection and a source of like welcomed kind of community there. When I moved to private practice world where I was working with people in different communities, often people who don't look like me, I had this question of something as I say simple in air quotes as do I wear my hair down or up in my photo online? And I did just choose to wear, as you may have saw early in the training, to wear my hair down. But there was this deliberation in my head as to, is this going to affect my resources, my ability to get clients to be able to have people to see me if they have certain negative associations to this form of self-expression? Those, and to some degree, could be questions that people may have that you're working with when it comes to selective expression or self-expression. And it is, I would say, and rather than pathologizing that or seeing that as solely social anxiety or something that needs to be corrected, it may also be compassionately acknowledged that these are things that may be very intentional decisions that they may want to make because of some of the costs that they anticipate. Undiscovered expression, however, it acknowledges that sometimes we don't always know how we're going to be received. If you go into a conference, or if you go into a new school, or if you go into a new space in your neighborhood, and you're just not sure what the social norms are, what the types of social messaging is about, your background, you may not necessarily know how open versus how selective to be. And so you may have to kind of figure out a place to start until you get more information. And so that may also be something to kind of talk through with your clients, especially if they're transitioning into a new space. That they haven't really kind of been able to assess kind of what the costs may look like for them there. And then last but not least, we have identity protection. So the first two are things that the exploration and expression in my kind of model here is things that can be done apart from necessarily like somebody saying something negative, like in a relationship stressor or a community not being supportive. But oftentimes, identity protection is when somebody is coming to me because they have felt hurt by some of the things that they've been exposed to. And not only is it causing emotional pain, but it's also causing them to struggle with thinking positively about this aspect of their background. And so, um, whenever I'm thinking about identity protection, there's like four general kind of categories of things that I'm considering when I'm working with somebody. And the first and probably the most important is how hurt do they feel? Right? If somebody is feeling overwhelmed and feeling angry and frustrated or anxious or overwhelmed or feeling a great degree of shame about as a result of some of the messaging that they've experienced, it's going to be hard to go to some of the more cognitively oriented or behaviorally oriented interventions I'm going to talk to. The first step may be starting with like helping them to process why this hurts so bad and the impact of this emotionally and how they can maybe kind of regulate and cope with that emotion before we get to some of the other more cognitive interventions that I'll talk with. And so as a place to start, I'll kind of call back to the emotional stress tools that we went over earlier in our time together. But then afterwards, if the person has space for being able to process some of the messages and also the self-talk that they have space to use some of the interventions that we'll talk about in just a moment, then I try to lean into that. And then the bottom right hand corner, growing my positive identity self-talk, is, my sense that while we're also kind of helping somebody to protect and heal from these types of experiences, I also want to keep in mind like what things are they doing to kind of, maybe outside of that experience to kind of explore and express in spaces that are more safe and they're more protected from these cultural stresses. How are they also finding ways to kind of build up their self-love, self-confidence, and cultural pride with some of the things that we just talked about as well? So, but talking about kind of these, particularly the squares, is called filtering my self-talk and filtering my social messages. That's what we're going to conclude with before we wrap up. So, this thing here that I put together that kind of looks like a Pokemon ball is essentially a graphic that I started drawing in my office a couple years ago. And in the center, I used to draw a stick figure where I put the word me associated with it. And what I would say is like, on the top, I would say like positive identity self-talk, bottom is negative identity self-talk. And I would just want to get a sense of like, what are some of the things people say or think about themselves that would maybe fall in each of those two categories. And then we would kind of talk about the ecosystem around this quote unquote Pokemon ball. What are the messages around them that might influence the degree to which they have either type of these self talks and the degree to which they believe the type of self talk that they may have? And so again, it's maybe taking time to kind of think through like, what are some of the stereotypes that you've been exposed to? What are some of the judgments or just sources of discrimination or other types of messaging? And this is where, especially when I'm working with younger populations, I'll pull in parents or caregivers to be able to sit down and kind of maybe ask them before I broach the subject with their children, what kind of conversations have they had with their children about these different types of kind of ways that cultural stresses can manifest in their day-to-day lives and their children's day-to-day lives. So that's really a referencing the concept of racial socialization and really helping them to think about, is this a conversation that they've ever had with their kids, and really kind of collaborating with parents before I bring it up with their kids, how can we kind of collaborate and think about the just most strategic way, because it does seem like your child is being affected by these types of messages. And so how can I kind of partner with you, or can I partner with you in helping you to kind of have these conversations? And then for adults, it is really kind of asking again that permission. Can we talk a little bit about some of the things around you that you may be exposed to that may be influencing the dialogue that you're having with yourself? And so those are different ways to kind of ask permission to kind of broach these subjects depending on the age that you're working with. So when it comes to the filtering social messages, again, these are the things like the comments that people see on social media. These are the messages that maybe they grew up hearing from their family members. These are offhanded comments that they maybe hear in the news, and how these messages might then again infiltrate and influence how they think about themselves. And so these are just some questions that I might help them use to kind of create this like filter, or help them to think through how they are making sense of the messages and how they want to live knowing that these messages exist. And so, for example, let's say somebody has told me that they've gotten messages from their environment that Black people in my field are not smart or are less qualified. Well, I may first by start off by asking them, what evidence have they heard in their environment that supports this social message and that does not support this social message? And so, one of the things for me individually, I enjoy documentaries. And one of the PBS documentaries I recently watched really kind of goes and walks through some of the very kind of genius and very responsible, very intentional, very kind of just wise choices that many of my Black ancestors made throughout the years in multiple different industries, which for me, if I was struggling with this type of social message, that exposure to that content kind of acts as a counterfactual that I choose to wrestle with. What does that mean that I know that there are these other individuals in the world who are capable, who are qualified, who are contributing wonderful things to the society, and they happen to share the same background as me, how do I also bring that into the mix of the messaging that I'm trying to wrestle with right now? For who am I truly, right? This goes back to if somebody has completed their who am I diagram and they've taken some time to think about kind of the stable characteristics of kind of who they are in terms of how they see themselves, and then they are confronted with the social message that challenges that, kind of really thinking like, all right, so yes, I acknowledge that this message in the world exists, but who am I still? What it still remains true and unchanged about me, even though this message exists out there in the world. Identity consistent message. Is there any part of my of this social message that is consistent with your who am I diagram? If yes, what efforts can you make in your daily life to strengthen your belief in this? In this case, I would, hope that we could kind of get to a place where somebody actually says, you know what, like I don't see messages that are, I don't see this as being consistent with my who am I diagram for a number of different reasons. So then hopefully we were able to kind of spend some time with what efforts can we make to remind yourself that this message doesn't represent who you are. So that can then bring you back to some of the identity exploration things, like watching documentaries, like I mentioned. Not everybody's a documentary watcher, but that's just an example. Or finding ways to get into certain forms of identity expression that really builds up and reminds you of like the more stable and beautiful aspects of yourself. And then, of course, this is not an exhaustive list of questions that can be used to process these types of messages. Like one example that I didn't add, but that has often come up is how credible is the source? How much do I feel like this person knows me? And do I feel like I trust their words? And that can also be really informative as a tool as well. Similarly, if sometimes these messages, and even though you're able to kind of poke holes in the messages around you, they still, as I mentioned before, find their way to ways of wiggling themselves into the identity self-talk as it was for Jasmine. And so it's similar kind of sets of questions here can also be used as it comes to these different domains of who am I truly, identity consistent thoughts, and supportive thoughts. Like, is this self-talk guiding you closer to your goals or values? So this particular one here I found to be the most helpful because it doesn't require the person to acknowledge that their self-talk is not true or that they don't believe it, but it maybe spends more time focusing on, okay, so if this self-talk is kind of like this guest, uninvited guest that's in the background, what choices do you want to still be making even though this kind of thought process is there? How can we still lean on your goals and values even if this thought process is still kind of the volume on that thought sometimes gets turned up every now and again. And so that's a way to kind of not always have to lean into change and having the person to be convinced, but you can also kind of still be helping them to kind of move forward towards more activities that promote self-loving, confident, and pride-related thoughts. All right, so we are through the entire agenda for today. I'm very excited and curious to hear your thoughts, both thoughts of, questions about application, and also you may have different opinions on this model and how I've constructed it. And I do find that's me trying to practice openness. And so I'm very curious to hear about what your thoughts are. So this is the journey we've been on, noticing these cultural stresses, assessing the cultural stress impacts, and then helping people to kind of build this I can in response to the different impacts that they experience, and then applying the skills, like their abilities and resources to hopefully navigate the ways in which these situations create demands on their life. And I also just want to conclude here by stating that it is very common for all three impacts to be happening at once. And so sometimes you have to kind of sort through which is of greatest priority. So here are some questions to kind of help you sort through that as a clinician. Which of the three impacts is most interfering to their goals at this moment in time? Which of them is most interfering with their values or causing the greatest degree of distress? And sometimes you may even want to ask the client one or a combination of these questions to help to be collaborative and kind of figuring out the next steps. So I'm definitely here for any comments or questions. So, and then if you found that any of this material was very interesting to you, and you want more support, shameless plug here, is feel free to get a copy of my book that has many different worksheets and tools in there to kind of apply everything that I talked about. And then also here are some of the resources that I offer as well in my contact information if you want to learn more about the REACH program and the services that we can provide. And so with that, I'll turn it over to my team at the Trust to kind of curate the Q&A for the remainder of our time today.
Okay, looks like I'm back on. Dr. DeLapp, I would like to give you a minute to take a deep breath and maybe have a good swallow of water. We do have some questions for you, and I want to thank you for this very informative and interesting presentation. I know the whole issue, the issues that you're talking about are issues that therapists have to deal with, and there are a lot of states now that do require cultural competency kinds of continuing education, and I hope that our participants have found your workshop to be very helpful in that regard. But even more importantly, I hope that they have found your presentation to give them more confidence about their abilities to be culturally competent in dealing with clients that come to them. So we have a few questions. A couple here are in regard to responding to clients. And the first one is, any suggestions about what to do or not to do when a client uses a slur or a stereotyping expression or makes disparaging comments towards a particular group? It could be a part of a group I identify with or one I'm not part of.
Mm-hmm.
In any other sphere, I would address them directly, but I'm uncertain what is best with a therapy client.
Yeah.
Dilemma issues that if I don't address it, I'm likely to be distressed and distracted for the rest of the session. So how do we respond to clients who may use a slur or stereotypical kinds of expressions or disparaging comments toward a particular group during the process of their therapy session?
So excellent question. And I think you will likely get different answers depending on the orientation that you practice. For me, I am a big fan of protecting your peace, right? So um, I can't do my job well if I feel attacked and I don't feel safe. And so, if in that situation, the slur feels directed towards me, I think that then goes to like the area of the agency stress component of my model. It's like, do you feel that you are able to safely address that with the client? And so, language that I could use is, I'd like to pause and acknowledge that the comment you just made, and um, if it were me, I would say something along the lines of, I'm actually having a hard time hearing what else you shared because my brain is still kind of stuck because I'm distracted and I feel a little hurt at this moment in time. Another alternative, if that feels like bringing too much of your emotions into the mix, but you also are aware, particularly if this person has some interpersonal struggles elsewhere, um, you may ask a question along the lines of, I'm curious if that's language you use with other people in your life. And how, if you do use this language or that term with other people in your life, how have they historically responded to you? Has that ever, do you typically feel affirmed and supported in using that language? Or do you find yourself, um, isolated, or people change in response to that comment? And then in the event that that doesn't feel like a safe space for you to address that directly, um, I'm thinking about like trainees that I've worked with who maybe are unsure how to do that. I also find that it's helpful as a treatment team, especially if you are in a team that has this philosophy of these are our clients and not just each individual therapist client, to be able to kind of take that to the team and say, how can we support this person who feels like they've tried to address this with this client directly, and the client continues to subject them to this type of these slurs or this messaging, and the therapist does not feel safe? What is the clinic policies around forcing clinicians to continue with that type of that client. So those are just a couple of thoughts off the top of my head.
Great, thank you. Here's another one. Recently, a few adult clients have been worried about my travels and seem to carry a bit more anxiety about my well-being with current political events.
Mm-hmm.
I allow for space to name and validate these and brainstorm ways to channel this into their preferred ways of advocacy. I try to keep the focus on them with some relevant self-disclosure that is in service of them and joining with them.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you might share more nuances with managing similar experiences.
Well, to be transparent, I haven't had a similar experience where a client has expressed concerns about my well-being regarding travel, but definitely folks who've, asked the question of how am I doing, or how have I been handling some of the, whether it's like race-related concerns that were happening several years ago or that continue to happen. And again, in those particular moments, I try to think about, um, like, this isn't my place to process, and I try to think about what is the concern that like how they feel that this may affect their care. And if this is legitimately about they're just trying to be a kind, empathetic human, then I give them the answer. It's like, thank you for your compassion and your concern. I'm trying to be responsible, and I share your concerns. But I do appreciate you checking in, and I'd like to kind of just see kind of how you've been doing this week. So I would maybe try to return it back to you and return it back to them, or ask if there are any of the events that they are asking me about are things that they feel have lasting impacts for themselves, just because maybe that's an indirect way of them trying to broach a subject about something they're struggling with by possibly thinking about how I may be struggling with it as well.
Thank you. Dr. Delap, this next question is it's a supervision issue.
Okay.
And the participant said, I have a supervisee who has a sex worker as a client, and she is struggling with the morality. She has done safety planning with the client. How do I help my supervisee in responding to this client from a different, quote, world, unquote?
I mean, I think the exercise that I kind of talked about a little bit earlier about having the supervisee spend some time with the who am I diagram, and then really thinking about um, maybe I don't know if they've asked their client or will feel comfortable asking their client to use the who am I diagram, but also maybe thinking about the assumptions that they have about their client's who am I diagram, right? Because of like possibly what they might assume this person values or is interested in, or what their strengths are, because of their certain biases that they may have towards the sex worker community. Um, that may be very kind of eye-opening to see how to compare and contrast what actually is a part of the who am I diagram with what they assume is going to be in that. And then also kind of coming back to, I think, some mindfulness. Like, we don't always have to agree with our clients' decisions. We don't always have to feel that our clients are like their occupation, like their interests, like what they do. But we have to kind of anchor our responses, in my opinion, to the conceptualization, and to kind of really thinking about how we can be patient-centered. And I think if there's a sound conceptualization and a sound understanding of the qualities within the Who Am I diagram, it goes back to how is the supervisee focusing and centralizing those qualities while also utilizing supervision effectively to be mindful of what comes up for them. It's not bad to feel those things. It's just, how can you be thoughtful about when they come up and how they influence your choices and the type of support you offer.
Thank you. This next question is in regard to resources. And I give you a little plug here. Dr. DeLap's research tools, treatment tools, is a very excellent research document that he included with his slides. So I would encourage all of you to take a look at those. But here's the question. Do you have suggestions for how to find community resources for Black tweens and teens in a majority white community when their family doesn't have ideas, and these children are starting to become more aware because of aging and noticing microaggressions and openly racist comments. By resources, I mean opportunities for hanging out with other Black or biracial kids. Lots of openly racist remarks from Latino kids in our community are directed towards Black children, Black
Hmm.
youth.
Yeah. So with without knowing the exact community, I mean, I think that would be kind of challenging. I don't know how this person or how you all feel about AI, but I think AI is, I've used that as a uh, place to brainstorm some of these types of questions about access and community building. But then I have also kind of called places to vet them and ask like questions about the types of sources and resources that they have. I think the other question is, is this young person or are the young people you're talking about, are they open to virtual connections? Because I think that, for example, in the Reach program, we offer wellness groups that are, virtual, and that allow kids from different spaces to be able to connect. And so that's also an option that may not necessarily provide that, in-person direct contact, but there are maybe some virtual options out there as well. Um, and then the other third thing is, I don't know, I don't want to make assumptions about the mobility and the resources of the family, but there have been some families who have looked at surrounding communities and tried to travel and plan trips around certain identity exploration trips. Like I recall, even when I was growing up, a church that I attended did a civil rights tour of the South, and it was one of the highlights of my childhood, but it was something that was affiliated with a church or an organization that allowed me to get out of my community and learn some things as well. So that may also be accessible depending on their resources.
Thank you. Here's a process related question from one of our psychologist participants. I'm curious and wondering if you proceed from the emotional stress section to the agency stress section and finally the identity stress section, or can you begin with any one of the three initially? Like kind of where do you
Yeah,
enter
that's a great
into that
question.
into
Great
that
question.
processing?
So for me, I usually start with emotional stress as the initial because, you know, uh, if somebody is bringing this up, in my experience, the clue that this is something to bring up often comes with some sort of emotional discomfort. And so I want to be mindful of that emotional discomfort and making sure that they have the tools that feel responsive to that. One thing I also didn't talk about in this training that can also be a part of the emotional stress component is self-compassion. I find that sometimes that in that maybe they do have some like regulatory skills they can go to, but there's some self-critical thoughts such as like I'm being weak or I need to be stronger or this shouldn't affect me this much. So those types of very dismissive language of their emotional experience. And so that may also be an early intervention at first. And then after that, I try to consult to the client and ask, within your beat, I'm hearing a little bit of identity stress and or I'm hearing a little bit of agency stress. Do either of these feel like something you would want to focus on? And then we kind of go with that from there. But I definitely always want to make sure that there's some sound foundation, no emotion regulation skills before we launch into some of the other things, especially given that like agency stress and particularly change efforts can bring their own sources of emotional discomfort. And then also identity stress, and when you kind of start helping people to identify some of like the social messages that may be influencing how they feel about themselves, that can sometimes be at times dysregulating. So making sure they have some of those tools can be really a good foundation to start with.
Do you address ancestral trauma with your clients? Does that typically come up? I know you work a lot with children, I think too, but which so it may not be something they can articulate very well. But is ancestral trauma something that you work on with clients, and if so, how do you go about that?
So when it comes to the ancestral piece, I think I come back to this idea that cultural stresses are not rooted solely in the context of like what you've experienced. But there also are things that maybe your family has been exposed to, and or that you feel has generationally just been a part of their family's experiences or their community's experiences. And so for kids, I don't usually tend to go that far back in time. I try to keep it more in the here and now. But for adults, I find that that is really, especially they're looking for a little bit more of the like the historical why. And sometimes that does require going back and looking at family patterns, family traumas, certain types of belief systems that maybe have been adopted within families that have roots in racism that have also been passed down, and really kind of helping people to kind of think about the lasting impacts of that. And so I find that that typically comes up within the identity stress component of things, especially when I'm unpacking the social messages and the sources of stereotypes, biases, and discrimination that that person has been exposed to. And that can often be the time that the ancestral piece or the intergenerational traumas come up.
So here it's a question in regard to some immigration concerns, which certainly have been in the front of our news on a daily basis.
Hmm.
What are the best ways, Dr. DeLapp, to support individuals who are thinking about or fearing immigration raids in the therapeutic process? For example, a client who may not want to leave their home due to the fear of being detained by ICE. Is that something you've come across? And or if you did, what is a way that you would suggest that the therapist could be supportive in regard to a
Yeah.
client's immigration concerns?
I mean, I've not necessarily directly worked with clients, unfortunately, family members who are struggling with that type of concern. More of my experience has been with people who have friends who are in that situation and are looking for ways to support them. I mean, in this day and time, like the concept of safety and what feels predictable in terms of how to kind of manage life right now for these individuals is something that I really haven't wrapped my mind around yet. And so I guess one of the things is really starting off with this concept of safety and leaning into kind of some of the communities of support that they have. And I find that there are sometimes the communities have like these communications or sources of support of like this is kind of sources of protection, sources of kind of safe zones versus non-safe zones. So rather than kind of myself being kind of the source of kind of knowledge here, I might try to kind of lean into some of the community organizations where I'm practicing or where around this person and kind of just start storing up resources about kind of like what are some of the legal aids and legal kind of institutions kind of suggesting and recommending what are there safe zones within the community that have been shown to be protective and have a good track record of that, and kind of maybe even collaborating with them and asking them their feedback as to some of the things that they're supporting the people there who are using those as sanctuaries, so that I'm more kind of attuned to that community and that community's rhythms of how ICE may or may not be affecting that community. And so that would be my place of starting.
If your client's stressful event is one that you're connected to,
Hmm.
would you ever reference that? For instance, in the Buffalo example, if you're from Buffalo and an alma mater is nearby the site, et cetera, how might you um,
Yeah.
how might you relate to the client about that, or would you, and if so, how?
So in that particular example, I could not. I myself really was struggling myself in that situation, and I noticed that I did not trust that my own self-regulation could I didn't trust my self-regulation in that moment to be able to uh, self-disclose in a way that allowed me to still be focused on his needs and not my own. And so that was one decision that I made was, I'm really going to try to focus on asking the questions about where he's at, how he's feeling, how he's navigating the situation. And I ended up really having to like to do some self-care after that appointment because of how close it hit home for me. And so I think that was a part of my self-assessment, and that's one that I would encourage those who feel personally affected, to be thoughtful about how their self-disclosure might unearth certain things that may kind of influence how much space they can hold for the client's feelings.
Mhm.
I also can appreciate that maybe sometimes that there's not that foreknowledge. So you may think that this is a self-disclosure or an acknowledgement of like, yeah, like, this is, for me, whenever I've been going through, actually, let me answer the question. If I did feel like I could have acknowledged it, I use my experience as less of a, this is me too kind of a thing and more of an assessment tool. And the assessment tool is like, one of the things I've noticed for myself and or people around me that I've talked to. So I don't always just keep it just with me or people around me that I've talked to, is that this is something that they've experienced. I'm curious, is this a part of your experience as well? So again, my self-disclosure doesn't just rest with them saying yes or no to my experience, but it's saying that my experience also aligns with others a little bit, and so that way, if they're not just denying my experience if they say no, but they're like, oh no, that's not a part. So it kind of reduces some of the possible conflict or the tension there, of having to align or not align. But I do think that sometimes it's mindful. We have to be mindful as clinicians that we are human as well, and that though we may be using self-disclosure strategically, there's maybe a moment where that strategic nature can go to less strategic, and trying to be thoughtful about that as well, and utilizing our non-therapeutic spaces for our sources of support, which is something I've had to learn while doing this work a lot. Is that you can definitely have an academic understanding and have a lot of cases that you've worked with, but that doesn't necessarily make you immune.
Well, this is definitely a field in which we are always learning. So,
Yes.
something new
Yes.
every day, and a lot from our clients, that's for sure. So
Yes.
here is one psychologist who's speaking of some of the politics of the time. Uh, my mind is whirling with so many ideas, and thank you so much for your presentation. I live in a painfully conservative area.
Mm,
Would this work with a person who is MAGA? And if
mm,
so, would one modify it, and how?
mm,
How about working with a prison population? And
mm.
thanks again.
Yeah. Whew. I can't say that I have taken the time to really think about the application of this for conservatives and or for individuals in MAGA. I mean, I think part of the assumption of this model is that there is a historical context of marginalization and a historical context of um, like shared experience um, that I think this model speaks to within the context of persons of color, other marginalized communities that I haven't necessarily thought through. I'm also making the assumption, like, a lot of, I'm not saying that individuals there's intersectionality here. So individuals can be persons of color and also conservative and part of MAGA, right? So there may be some intersectionality there that I would have to be thoughtful about in terms of that piece. But if the person is white and also a part of this conservative community, there are components of white identity development that are different. And I think there are others out there who are more well versed in white identity development than myself to be able to speak on how this model may or may not need to be amended for that purpose.
Mhm.
In the context of a prison population, um, I do think the concept of like uh, feeling a sense of efficacy and control can is different in that environment. The way the agency stress might manifest. I have not necessarily worked in that population previously, and so it may be need to be thoughtful about kind of how um, kind of that sense of I can and I can't kind of gets kind of divided up. Now I can see how it could be helpful in helping in individuals in this population possibly cope ahead for their time after release, particularly if they are, persons of color, but then they also have a misdemeanor or a felony on their record, and that may create community stresses and limit certain access points to sources of support in their community, or may cause them to be exposed to certain forms of judgment if people learn about this, their history. That may be something that could be a tool for helping them to cope ahead for that, and or to process time before their incarceration as well, in terms of, particularly I'm imagining a young person that I talked to who, a part of their frustration and in response to community stressors or systemic racism was some delinquent behavior. And so that delinquent behavior, unfortunately, excuse me, did not cause this young person to have interactions with law enforcement, but it very well could have. And so helping that young person, maybe if I was meeting them in juvenile detention center or elsewhere, might have helped me to kind of talk to them about what may have contributed to their choices in that moment, that they engaged in that type of behavior as well.
Okay, so now I have a wrap up last question. I want to hear your elevator speech. I'm a
Okay.
clinician new to using the REACH framework.
Uh-huh.
What are some simple steps for me to begin implementing culturally responsive mindsets and assessments in my next client session?
Wonderful question. First question is complete your who am I diagram. First thought is complete your who am I diagram and think through the reflection questions, not just with yourself, but with people within your professional community. And then the second thing is broach the subject. Find some ways within that slide where I said kind of assessing tools related to relationship and community stressors to try to at least create the semblance of openness to your clients that this is a topic of conversation we can have. And then last but not least is get good at using the beat diagram to listen for how these things make people feel. And you may not need to kind of introduce the terms agency stress, emotional. Sometimes people don't want to know all those terms. But in your head, this can be a decision tree of when I hear somebody's in their beat, one part of it is louder than the other, that you're saying maybe this might be a greater source of support that I can go with. And that may help you to kind of implicitly, internally create a treatment plan.